It's there, creeping through the crevices at the edge of your consciousness, silently stalking you just beyond the corners of your eyes. Something is desperately wrong and you try to scream. Then there, a light, a candle in the Stygian darkness, upheld in the right hand of a hooded figure. He stoops to brush the decaying detritus of the autumn of our image, and there it is, shining through the silvery glow of the hidden path.
One day the lead stops falling, and I fly out from God knows where. Four wheels.
Greetings and welcome to the Hidden Path Podcast. I'm your host, Resonance Rich. This show is brought to you by godlikeproductions.com. For those not familiar, Godlike Productions is a website set up in the format of a community forum where people from all around the globe can discuss topics that range from current events all the way to far-out conspiracies. For those of you who are users of GLP, we'd like to ask you to consider purchasing a premium membership to help support it. You'll get some awesome perks and an awesome feeling inside knowing you're helping out a community that isn't on the side of the big bag fake MSM. We also have a website for the podcast. It is http://www.hiddenpathpodcast.com. Tonight, it is Saturday night, September 29th, the 2018th year of our Lord, and my guest tonight is GLP's own Dr. Deplorable Astromut. He is a well-known figure on Godlike Productions as a very talented and gifted astronomer. He brings us a lot of great content. He's got a YouTube channel. It's called Astronomy Live, where he shows us the majestic scenery of the universe that he has captured with astrophotography. And I got him on the line here with me now. How you doing, Astromut?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, it's an honor to have you on, man. Yeah, just speaking of GLP, how long have you been a user of GLP, by the way?
Oh man, that's a good question. It's been a long time. Let me see here. Actually, I can pull that up right now. I've been on there for 9 years now. Going on 10 years next July.
Yeah, man. You're a well-known figure there. A lot of people, they really love your content. They love you're very intelligent when it comes to this kind of thing, and you spend a lot of time debunking some of the more crazier theories we got floating around about space and the universe, you know? Probably because you're a little bit closer to it than most of us.
Yeah, I mean, I've grown up around it, and the funny thing about it is when you debunk stuff like that, you have to understand the subject.
Yes.
Even if you think you understand it, you end up learning a lot more about it that you otherwise wouldn't have learned, because there's just so many things that you have to familiarize yourself with in order to address a particular claim. So you might know at a high level, well, the claim's wrong because X, Y, and Z, but if you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty, you have to educate yourself even more. So in the process, it's improved me. It's made me a better amateur astronomer.
Yeah, and that's like life itself. We we encounter things we don't understand. We try to learn, and in the process, we learn more for ourselves. So that's great. What are some of the more aggravating ones that you got to deal with? What's the most aggravating one that you encounter the most, maybe?
Well, it's funny. I was just on another YouTube channel earlier tonight addressing an aggravating one that started off as, I'm not kidding, a couple guys actually claiming with their channels that I was the same person as another debunker on YouTube who's notorious for debunking SpaceX hoaxes and flat Earth stuff. Because he comes out with me and films a lot of rocket launches. In fact, to be fair, he probably films even more rocket launches than I do. But we team up a lot together and film them. And so they were claiming that we were actually the same person, and I was like his nicer alter ego or something.
Yeah.
And so we debunked that, and then they apologized when they realized actually they were wrong about that. We proved to them we're not the same person. And then they immediately turned around and said, okay, well, it's great that you proved you're not the same person, but your videos are still all CGI.
Wow.
Your launch footage is fake. And so
wow.
that, to me, is the most annoying probably, is when they um, when they have nowhere left to go,
Yeah, and they
they
start
basically have to
grasping.
claim.
Right.
Yeah, they just have to claim that everything you do is fake. It's all CGI. It's a lie.
That's got to be frustrating, though, don't you? I mean, even for somebody, I got to give it to you for going out there and fighting the fight for truth. Honestly, I mean, you've seen it with your own eyes, so you're fighting it. You go out and film these rocket launches. You go out and film all this stuff with your own eyes and your own equipment. It's got to be frustrating,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, I mean, it definitely is. And growing up, to give you a bit of background,
Sure.
I grew up near the Space Center where they launched these rockets near Cape Canaveral.
Oh,
I
sweet.
saw most of the space shuttle launches in person, either from my lawn or while I was at school. When I was growing up at school, we would always go outside to watch the shuttle launch because you could see it from the playground. You could just see this thing going up, and
Yeah.
so school would just stop what it was doing, and we would go and watch it. I saw Challenger explode
Oh, you
from my
did?
front lawn. Oh
Oh,
yeah, I was
man.
supposed to be at school that day. I was out with the chicken pox, I believe, and so I was at home, and my mom at the time worked. I'm not sure if she was working at that time for NASA. She did for a little while. She was a secretary out at the Cape, and so she was familiar with the shuttle system and
Yeah.
familiar with the fact that some of the fuel on board was toxic. And so we were watching it explode, and I didn't understand at first what was happening. I knew it wasn't normal, but
Right.
I didn't understand what it really meant. I was too young. But my mom immediately understood what it meant, and she
Oh,
kept looking for the shuttle to come out of the cloud. She kept expecting to see it, soaring out of the cloud and come back around for a landing. And of course, that never happened. And when she realized that wasn't going to happen, she literally picked me up and ran me back inside because she was afraid the cloud might be too toxic. It might, come down and poison people with toxic fumes. Of course, it actually went out over the ocean. It wasn't blowing back
yeah.
our direction. But anyway, so I saw that happen in person. I've seen countless other rocket launches in person, and so that's really kind of how I got interested in it from a very young age. Is seeing
Living
this
right
seeing this
there.
occurring in
Yeah.
person. And as a kid, my mom and my dad would tell me that some people don't even believe that we landed on the moon. Some people don't even believe that these rockets are launching. And I'm thinking, well, why don't they just come here? You can
Right.
see it. I
Yeah, you
mean,
can.
I
Yeah.
mean, I've had them before.
That's
I've
the
had them
thing too. Which
before.
one?
Where,
Which one was that blew up? Was that the one with the teacher on it? I know there was a teacher that was on one of them, right?
yes,
That was that one.
yeah,
Okay.
Krista McAuliffe. She was supposed to be the teacher in space, and so with that program, that's kind of interesting because towards the end of the shuttle program, I think people became accustomed to seeing, if they paid attention to it, they became accustomed to seeing people who were initially civilians or scientists who became astronauts
Yeah.
and went through an extensive training process. But really, with Krista McAuliffe and the Teacher in Space program, the idea was that the shuttle was supposed to be so reliable and so flying so frequently that they could just grab people almost up off the street and
Right.
just chuck them in the shuttle as long as they're in good health, almost like a roller coaster ride. Are you in good health? You don't have any heart problems? Okay, get on board. You're good to go. And so with Krista McAuliffe, they picked a couple of teachers for this Teacher in Space program. Krista McAuliffe was supposed to be the first, and so she wasn't an astronaut per se. She was a teacher who was given the position of an astronaut and very quick and sort of crash course training of a sort. And she would ask, and one of the things I heard in interviews afterwards is sometimes she would ask questions because she wasn't an astronaut trained for years on this stuff,
Right.
and so she was learning the shuttle as she went. And so she would ask questions. Well, what if this happens? And the answer was simply, well, there is no recovery from that. If that happens, we lose the
Yeah.
vehicle and
It's a
we
very
lose the crew.
dangerous process for sure.
It is,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, unfortunately, that was a situation I think where NASA became too complacent, obviously, and really overestimated the safety of the shuttle system. Uh, it was just unfortunately a compromised design that was ultimately too flawed to be safe.
Mm.
And so there was a backup astronaut, actually, a backup teacher in space program member. Barbara Morgan was Krista McAuliffe's backup,
Okay.
and she was there watching the launch when it exploded. Fortunately, years later, she got to fly on the shuttle safely. She became a full-fledged astronaut, and they gave her the full training, not sort of the quick Krista McAuliffe training, but she actually made it into the astronaut program proper, and became an astronaut and flew on the shuttle up to the space station and back. So I believe, and I could be wrong, I'm going off my memory here, but I want to say she got to actually perform some of the lessons in space that Kristen was going to do from orbit, and was able to perform those for students back on Earth when she made it to space years later. But yeah, that was
Well, that's good
you
she
know, that
made it.
was
That must have been hard for her to watch that. My God.
oh yeah, there's footage of it, and they're all in shock. And
Yeah.
one of the things that people don't necessarily realize, because like when you watch it, if you watch a like Discovery Channel thing about it or whatever, sometimes I've seen them do this. I hate it when they do it, but sometimes in some of these documentaries that are not as well done, they'll add like an explosion sound effect when the thing blows up. That's not what happened. That's not what it sounded like, and that's why it was confusing as a kid. Because you would expect if it blows up, it's going to make a big boom or something. No, it's rumbling all the time. What happens there is it basically just stopped.
Yeah.
The roaring of the engines went out, and it stopped making noise.
Yeah, I'm
And
imagine from liftoff, it's very loud. It's got to be. Yeah.
it takes a few seconds
Right.
for it to get to you. It's
Yeah.
it's pretty well up before you start to hear the roar. But there was no audible sound of an explosion per se, and really it was more of a breakup at high altitude, and all of that.
Yeah,
The
it's
thing
a
about it
tragedy.
is it was, and even the people who were out there at the Space Center all were expecting the shuttle was going to come back and land. There were workers standing by at the landing strip, the landing runway, in case something went wrong during launch. One of the abort protocols was called RTLS, Return to Launch Site,
Right.
and they would flip the shuttle back around and they would deliberately fly it back to the landing site near the launch pads and land it there. So there were trucks waiting in case of an emergency, and they fired up their engines as soon as they saw it exploding. And they were all looking for it to come back, and to me that was heartbreaking, because you knew that
Oh
even
yeah.
they expected it to make it out.
Right.
Nobody went in that day to that launch expecting that it wouldn't come out alive. But there had been warning signs in previous launches, burn throughs of O-rings, where the first sort of protection layer started to fail,
Right.
and started to have burn throughs on the final layer, and they ignored it because they thought, it's fine. They became complacent and normalized failure, and relied on backups as normal. And so as long as the backup kept working, they were fine. Well, what happens when your backup fails? Then you lose a crew, and that's exactly what happened. And people often ask me on GLP or whatever,
Mhm.
do you believe in any NASA conspiracies? I mean, why don't you believe in any? Do you believe NASA always tells the truth? And honestly, I can tell them no, I don't. And yes, there was a conspiracy. There was a big conspiracy that happened after Challenger, and people don't always know this. And it's not as sensational
Right.
as
It's not
you
as
know.
Hollywood or cinematic as
Right.
what people would like, definitely.
No, it's not like the world's going to end in 2012. Obviously, that didn't happen,
Yeah.
but it's not that kind of sensational. But
Right.
it is a true, I think, a true conspiracy, because they knew what would happen if the public knew that the astronauts on board the Challenger were still conscious after the explosion and were aware of what was happening and had
Oh.
no way of escape. They
Oh,
probably would
geez.
have demanded. They probably would have demanded the end of the shuttle program right then and there. There probably wouldn't have been another
Wow.
flight.
So you're saying that they
Uh,
did know about that? That did happen?
yes,
Wow.
yes, and NASA knew, and they covered it up. Here's what happened. They did release some facts that indicated they were possibly conscious, but it wasn't 100%. They had oxygen bottles with their seats that they could turn on in the event of smoke in the cabin.
Mm.
It wasn't designed to provide. It was not like an airline. It wasn't designed to provide pressurized air to keep you conscious if the cabin lost pressure. They basically assumed, well, if the cabin loses pressure, we're dead anyway. But they found that some of the oxygen bottles had been turned on, so they thought, well, maybe that was the crew doing that. But if they were doing that to try to stay conscious because they were losing pressure, they would have lost consciousness within 2 or 3 seconds. I mean, it would have been
Right.
very quick.
Yeah.
But what they also found that they didn't release to the public for years. This only came out, I want to say about 10 years ago or
Yeah,
so,
and
when
when
an
did
astronaut.
when did it happen? What year was it? I know I was really small. Was it
Yeah,
88
it
or
was,
something?
no, it was. I want to say so. Challenger was 86 or 87.
Yeah, right around there.
I always get.
That sounds
Was
right.
it 1986? Yeah, it was
Yeah.
86. So what happened was an astronaut published this. Mike Mullen Mullane published this in a book about a decade ago or so, where he at the end of the shuttle program, I guess it's been less than a decade, but at the end of the shuttle program, he basically published a tell-all book called Riding Rockets, and there's a lot of fun and fascinating tales in there. But one of the more disturbing things he talked about was the fact that when they were piecing the Challenger back together, they looked at the inside of the cabin, what they found of it, and were piecing it back together, and they looked at the configuration of the switches on the pilot side, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And they found that certain switch throws had been made, which were not supposed to be made during a normal flight, but they indicated that the pilot was trying to restore power. And some of these switches had protectors over them where you have to
flip them over
to
get to
the switch. Yeah, and they had done tests, and they apparently established in their own internal testing that this could not have been due to it hitting the water. It had to have been done by a deliberate switch throw.
Yeah, because those things probably are designed just to be that way, where they can't accidentally switch. It has to be, right.
Right,
wow.
Right. It's got to be, in a certain direction and all of that, And the switch throws indicated it wasn't random. It indicated an intelligent response by the crew where they were trying to restore power to the cabin. Because at this point, what happened when the Challenger disintegrated was the crew compartment became separated from the rest of the vehicle. And it basically fell, and the astronauts would have been alive until they hit the water. The forces of the explosion were not sufficient to cause fatal injury. Even if they had lost cabin pressure, they probably would have been alive until they hit the water minutes later. But the question was really, did they lose cabin pressure? Did they pass out almost immediately and give them sort of a peaceful death? And the switch throws made by the pilot would seem to suggest not right away for sure.
No.
But they had enough time to contemplate what was going on and try to restore the situation. And one of the astronauts, I believe, was quoted as saying, and I'm going off memory here again, so I may be paraphrasing here a bit, but basically suggesting that the pilot and commander flew the shuttle all the way into the water, in a desperate attempt to save themselves.
Wow. Yeah, see, this is something I never knew about, and I could kind of see their point in covering it up. I guess it's not the right thing to do. People should know the truth, but I could see their point. It is people kind of want to feel that people take the easy way out, right? Like, they had an easy death. It was real fast. It was real quick. They didn't have to suffer, right? Suffering. So, yeah, I can see why they want to not push that out to the public. Yeah, that's interesting, man. I did not know that. What was the shuttle program? It was pretty successful for the most part, do you think? Or do you think there was a lot of issues?
Oh, there were definitely a lot of issues, and a lot of it, unfortunately, stemmed from sort of the compromise design that became the shuttle. So the shuttle was supposed to be part of a larger program to establish a space infrastructure to be able to go to the moon and beyond in a sort of routine sense. And to do that, they needed a space shuttle that could help them build a space station and maintain it and bring up other satellites and supplies that they would need.
Right.
And the thing was, NASA didn't really have the money to develop it themselves. The Apollo program was winding down. NASA's budget was getting cut, and they had to decide what they were going to do with the money that they would have left. And so they went to the DoD and they said, look, to the Department of Defense, and they said, look, we got this idea for a reusable space shuttle that we could really bring down the cost of launching things, because up until that point, all rockets have been fully expendable. One-time use only, that's all you get. And so obviously that's a lot more expensive than if you had a vehicle that you could quickly and easily reuse.
Like SpaceX's thing.
Exactly. We're now seeing the sort of that dream come alive, that goal come to fruition with SpaceX. But back then that didn't happen. And I think we're already starting to take SpaceX for granted. But back then there were no SpaceX rockets that were landing themselves.
No.
So the DoD said, you know what, that's an okay idea. We can see some utility in that, but we want you to have these requirements for the design. They wanted it to be capable of doing polar orbits, because a lot of the spy satellites that they would need to go into polar orbits. So they built not only launch facilities out in Florida, but a lot of people don't realize this. There was a launch facility at Vandenberg in California. They were supposed to be able to launch from Vandenberg south and take an inclined orbit basically directly over the poles. And that would allow them to deploy satellites to sun-synchronous orbits, and some of these orbits that are designed such that the spy satellite always passes over a given location on the Earth at the same time of day in a repeating cycle.
Yeah.
So that way, if you compare your spy satellite photos, you have the same lighting conditions, you have the same shadows on the ground, so it makes it easy to tell what the enemy's doing in terms of what they're changing at a given, missile site or whatever.
Right.
And so to do that, the shuttle had to have larger wings than it really needed. Because if you had for one thing, if you had an emergency on launch, there was one abort mode that was called abort once around, where they couldn't quite make it to orbit, but they could make it once around the planet. And so they would have to be able to come back and land where they started. Now, if you're launching east out of Florida, that's pretty easy because Earth's rotation is not going to throw Florida much out of your direction of travel by the time you come back around.
Right.
But if you're launching south from California, 90 minutes later, when you come back around to California again to try to land, California is now moved by how much the Earth is rotated in 90 minutes, which is going to be, I want to say, about 21 degrees thereabouts. So you have to compensate for that. That means you need big wings to be able to steer yourself back to California when you come back around once around. So that was one limitation. There was also some suggestion, I don't know if this is true or not, but the rumor I heard was they wanted to be able to launch once around deliberately so that they could launch into space, go grab a Soviet satellite, stick it in the payload bay, steal it, and then land on that very orbit.
Snatch and grab.
I don't know how they snatch and grab. I don't think that would have ever worked. I don't see that as being practical, but that was the rumor anyway.
Wow.
And so that's why they needed these big wings. They also needed the payload bay to be bigger than NASA would have otherwise probably designed it because they wanted to be able to fit really big spy satellites in there. Hubble is basically the same size as some of these spy satellites that they wanted to put in there. And so Hubble ended up being designed to basically spy satellite specs, which is good for us in a way. But on the other hand, that's probably bigger than what NASA wanted. So the upshot of all of this was you had this giant orbiter that was mounted parallel to a cryogenic tank where you have liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen at really cold temperatures. And so you're making that foam that's protecting that, because you don't want ice to build up on a metal structure. If you had a metal tank just sitting there bare exposed, you'd have ice coming off of it. You would just shatter that delicate heat shield facing the external tank every single time.
Right.
So instead they covered it in foam. Well, with Columbia, we found out that's not necessarily a great idea, too, because the foam can get brittle, and then it can break off, and then it can smash your heat shield, and then you die coming back into the atmosphere. And then with Challenger, the other problem was, okay, so you got these big solid rocket boosters mounted on the sides. So what happened with the Challenger there, you got flames cutting into the external tank. There's no way to shut off the solid rocket boosters. They're once you light them, they are on until they burn out. It's like a Christmas or a 4th of July firework. Once you light it, there's no turning it off.
It's done. Yeah.
It's done. It's gonna go. And so with the liquid engines, like on the shuttle's main engines on the bottom, you can shut those off at any time, but you can't do that with the solid rocket boosters. So they were stuck on that shuttle, riding it until those solids burned out. They had no other option. So with Challenger, there was no abort option.
Yeah.
Just all these design limitations. Ended up killing 2 crews. So it was in a sense fundamentally flawed. On the other hand, it did allow us to make some major breakthroughs in terms of how we handle spaceflight. When the space station was being designed, a lot of people looked at that and said that'll never ever work, because it's up until that point of the shuttle program, EVAs, extra vehicular activities, going in your spacesuit and getting out of your spaceship, was a pretty limited activity. There wasn't too much time spent doing that. There were some hours on the moon, obviously. There were some hours spent doing EVAs on other missions, but they called it the EVA wall in terms of looking at building the space station, because basically on every mission where they went and assembled a part, they'd have to get out of the spaceship to connect up cables on the outside and do work on the outside of the station. So there were a ton, just hundreds and hundreds of hours.
I'm sure they have so many checklists too before they even jump out of there. Yeah, it's probably a big process for sure.
It is. It's huge, and it's obviously dangerous too.
Definitely.
So a lot of people looked at that and said, you're gonna kill somebody doing that, because what if a micrometeoroid hits them? They're gonna get their suit punctured, and we actually have almost lost an astronaut on a space station EVA where they almost drowned because they sprung a water leak inside their suit. And some of the hoaxers will say, well, hey, that's proof they're doing it in a pool. Okay, first of all,
they need to cool it. They're in a vacuum.
If they were doing, okay, first of all, if they were doing it in a pool and they were faking it, why would they tell you the outtake? And why
Yeah.
wouldn't they just swim to the surface? Why they just swim to the surface a few feet up and get out of the pool? Okay, I mean,
Yeah.
and
Well,
then just do another take.
people don't understand is like your thermos works so good because it's got a vacuum in it. Most of the good ones, right? That's how they
Right.
contain the heat. So they need some coolant. Yeah, that would suck to almost drown in a suit though. Gosh,
Yeah,
I'm making me
exactly.
claustrophobic already. Jeez.
Yeah, I mean, and so that's and that's another thing that you didn't see this much after, say, the Gemini program, the very early space program, where we were competing with the Soviets and safety was kind of out the window a little bit. Sometimes, like with the very first spacewalk with Ed White, the very first American spacewalk, they did that pretty quickly after getting into orbit. You don't see them doing that anymore. They always have a few days on orbit before they ever attempt a spacewalk, because if you still have space adaptation sickness, in other words, you're vomiting. If you vomit in that suit with your helmet on,
Oh
you're
gosh.
possibly gonna, you know,
Yeah.
you're gonna
Vomit
asphyxiate on it.
again. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh
So not a good not a good combo there.
no.
So you don't see them doing that anymore. But it really, with the space station, it really taught us how to safely do spacewalks and prepare for contingencies like that. They also developed the what they call the safer system. So you remember back in the early shuttle days, they had that big backpack they would sometimes strap on to be able to fly freely,
Oh
and they
yeah.
used it in the
Was like air or something they used to jet themselves around? Was it air or
yeah,
did you use something
exactly.
else?
Well, I don't know if it was compressed air or something like that.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't. I'm guessing it probably wasn't hydrazine because that's toxic. But anyway, I'd have to look into it to see the
Yeah,
details
it's
on
kind of
what
like a
the.
jetpack for outer space, huh? They could move around with it or whatnot. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
So Bruce McCandless was the first to use that and fly free from the shuttle. And fun stupid trivia bit here. Bruce McCandless, he's the guy in that famous photo with him just sitting out there in the blackness of space and the Earth below him, and it's like this iconic photo of him in that suit with that backpack on, just floating out on his own. He was also Capcom for Apollo 11, so the very first moon landing. He was out on Capcom for that mission, not during the landing itself, but during the EVA. He was the guy that they were talking to at Houston. He would relay communication
Oh,
between the
okay.
mission controllers
Yeah.
and the astronauts on the moon. But anyway, he got to fly the MMU, the Man Maneuvering Unit, and that became sort of the safer system, and they miniaturized it, and obviously it's not as capable, but it's good in a pinch, in an emergency. They have a miniaturized version of that system now integrated into their spacesuits, so if they accidentally come off the station structure, if they slip off the rails and for some reason the tether's not working, they're not tethered, they can deploy these thrusters to basically maneuver themselves back to the station so that they won't float away.
Right. Right. Have a gravity moment there. That would be scary. Those are the scariest moments in space movies, by the way. It's like the guy's
Oh yeah.
floating out into the universe and they're trying to get him. Oh my god. Yeah. I don't know if I could be
Yeah.
an astronaut at all. That's just yeah. Um, so yeah, I can see your passion. Obviously, everybody at GLPs knows you're passionate about this stuff, so I can see why. As growing up as a kid over there by Cape Canaveral, um, and you said your mom might have worked for NASA, and we just seen your post today on GLP. You were talking about that you're looking to work for NASA. Is that the case? You're
So, well,
pursuing that?
yeah, well, that's the funny thing. I'm not, I wasn't the one pursuing this. It pursued me.
Oh wow.
It's an opportunity that has come up that I didn't anticipate, could not have anticipated, and I can't say too much about it at this point until
Yeah,
it's nailed down, obviously.
Understandable. Yeah.
Um,
But
but
extraordinary
basically, like I said,
opportunity, though, huh?
oh yeah, it's to me, it's really really cool. I mean,
Heck yeah.
man, like I said, it came to me. I didn't pursue it, but whether I like it or not, I might end up doing it, and I'm fine with that. I'm cool with that. But if that happens, I'll be working on supporting missions that will be happening on the International Space Station, future missions to the International Space Station, and so that sort of changes the dynamic between my relationship and GLP and even my YouTube channel, perhaps.
Definitely.
Obviously. As I've said for years, I'm not a shill. I'm not paid to do astronomy. I'm not paid to do anything with NASA. I have attended NASA socials before where they've invited me out to see launches behind the scenes, but they didn't pay for any of that. They didn't even buy me
right,
lunch. You know,
right.
that was me paying for it. They were just offering me the chance to come see things behind the scenes and take pictures. And that's all great, but this is a very different situation now. So I would be basically getting my paycheck in large part through NASA money. And at that point, I would
Yeah.
probably stop doing debunking, at least
Yeah,
actively.
but I mean,
Um,
I don't think we'd still even some of us wouldn't even look at you like a shill anymore. It's kind of like some people, they just know things because they're hands on, and it's so frustrating to see people talking about something they don't know, like they're professionals. Like everybody's an expert, right?
right.
Everybody's an expert with your life when it comes to you having problems and whatever it is, but no, it's just something you're passionate about and you know about it. I mean, hell, you've been filming this stuff in space. You filmed the SpaceX stuff. That is awesome. Where do they launch from, by the way? Is that down in Florida or is that out in Houston? I'm not even sure.
So they have launch facilities at Cape Canaveral,
Okay.
and they also rent one of the former shuttle launch pads, former shuttle slash Apollo launch pads, actually 39B, or 39A, sorry, 39 launch pad 39A. That is like I said, one of the former shuttle launch pads. It's also the launch pad that basically most, if not all, the men who walked on the moon left from that
Mm-hmm.
launch pad. And so they now lease that for their Falcon Heavy launches, and also that's where they'll be launching people from. So when they put people in the Dragon capsules here, hopefully starting next year, SpaceX is going to be launching astronauts to the International Space Station.
Wow.
They'll be launching off of Pad 39A. In fact, in the last few weeks, they just installed the crew access arm on that pad. So they had to take down the old shuttle structure to a large extent. They still have the most basic skeleton of what was originally the shuttle launch pad structure, but they've stripped down all the parts they don't need, and they've
Mm-hmm.
put a new crew access arm up, which looks really sleek. I mean, it looks really cool. They've definitely got a sense of style about their
Yeah.
their spacesuits, their launch pads, and everything. So they're gonna make it look real sleek, and they're gonna hopefully start launching astronauts out of there soon. They also have a launch pad on the Cape Canaveral side. So a lot of people don't know this. There's actually a difference between NASA Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral. They're two different facilities that happen to be next to each other. And so there's
Okay.
a line that sort of divides the NASA side from the Air Force side. So Cape Canaveral is an Air Force station, Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, and that's where the military launches all take place out of.
Oh, okay.
That's where you'll see Atlas and Delta launching from. That's also where some of the SpaceX
And
launches
that's where the guys
occur
get on
from.
YouTube and they're like, "I seen a UFO, look." And
Yeah, exactly.
I've seen those so many
So
times where they're
yeah, I
tearing through the
mean,
upper atmosphere and it looks like a comet's coming in or something. They're like, what's that? It's a launch. I think that
yeah,
happened over in
exactly.
California too recently. I remember you saying, "I already predicted this. Hey guys, hey, look, look." I'm like, "Oh, this is funny." Everybody's freaking
Oh
out.
yeah, yeah, the pre-dawn launches. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, that.
with California, you tend to get that effect actually in if you get it just after sunset, because they're launching from the west coast, and they're launching kind of south, sometimes southwest. So if you're launching into the sun while it's dark on the ground below, that's when you get that effect.
Oh, okay.
For Florida, it's pre-dawn launches. You don't tend to see it as much at sunset launches. Those can look spectacular too, but really it's the pre-dawn launches where you really see it,
Yeah.
where it will enter the sunlight after launching off the ground. With one of the SpaceX launches recently, I filmed it. Which one was it? I forget off the top of my head. I think it was CRS-15. I could be getting the number wrong, but it was a SpaceX launch that they launched from. That was probably from Slick 41. I think, I'm not 100% sure, but basically it goes into the sunlight, and then you get back illumination where the sun
Mhm.
is illuminating the exhaust while it's dark on the ground below, and you get really really strong contrast.
Yes. Yeah.
So I knew that was going to happen, and even though it was a weekday work day for me, and I knew it was going to be nuts, I went ahead and I said, all right, it doesn't matter, I'm going. So I drove out there, filmed the launch, packed everything up, ran back to work, and got in time for work. But yeah, that was a marathon day, but totally worth it
Hell
for that
yeah.
great footage.
Oh yeah.
And the funny thing is, right afterwards, almost on cue, one of these, Nibiru Planet X channels publishes a video. Planet X debris hitting the
Here
Earth's
it
atmosphere.
comes.
What do you know? What do you
Yeah.
know? It's the rocket launch.
The first time I seen that, actually, I was like, wow, that looks weird. And then you'd see it again, and you knew what it was because you found out the first time. And then you just see oh, here comes all the theories, Oh my gosh. Everybody's an expert, like I said. Um, what kind of, speaking of equipment, what kind of equipment do you use? I'm just curious. I probably won't know any of the names of anything. I'm not obviously into it, but I gotta imagine you have some pretty serious stuff as far as telescopes and whatnot.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've got a Meade LX200. It's an 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope. So this is what they call a catadioptric. It's a folded light path where you have a mirror in the back and a mirror up in the front that projects
Okay,
the image
yeah.
through a hole in the mirror in the back. So the light path gets folded inside the telescope tube, and this allows you to have a much higher focal length in a smaller package, which makes it convenient because I can pack it in the back of my sedan and take it anywhere.
Yeah.
And that's what I do for these launches. I'll pack it in my car and drive it over there. And then I control the telescope when tracking launches using my computer and hands-on throttle and stick joystick and throttle system with some software I've written to be able to control the telescope like that. This is actually
Man.
an older. It's an older telescope. It's actually designed in the mid 90s, and so they didn't anticipate the kind of technology we have now. They didn't anticipate people being able to update hardware using the internet. That wasn't really a thing back then.
Right,
And so
right.
there was no way to update the software on this telescope. The memory chips are sort of hard coded. To erase the memory chips, you would have to physically remove them and expose them to intense UV light. Also, if you pass it through an X-ray machine, you can get some bit flips. So don't send it. Don't take it with you on an airplane, because if they X-ray it, it can actually damage the memory chips. But
Oh
um,
yeah.
but
Yeah, those
basically,
those are
it's
the opposite of what is the other one, a refractor or reflector? What's the other one that's like a long tube? See, I'm
refractor.
refractor.
Yeah.
See, I'm so out
Mhm.
of it. Oh. I've been looking to
Yeah.
buy one
So
though, but the one you're talking about that you own is like a smaller type, and it's more it's like those orange ones they sell. Is that the Mead, the orange color ones they sell?
those are Celestrons. Yeah.
Celestrons, yeah.
The same optical design basically, but it basically has advantages in that you don't get chromatic aberration with a refractor, with the long tube telescopes with a lens on the front. The problem with the lens is it won't bring all the colors of light to the same focus point, and so you get color fringing on bright
Oh,
objects, especially like the moon or Saturn or whatever you're looking at. You'll get color fringes around the edges of it, and it won't look quite sharp. If you buy a more expensive refractor, you can compensate for that. But when you really get down to it, like trying to get a really high quality optic with a refractor is very expensive for a
oh
given
yeah.
size of telescope.
I'm sure.
It's much cheaper to be able to buy a mirror-based telescope like a catadioptric, like a Schmidt-Cassegrain, which uses basically mirrors for the most part to direct the light, and that doesn't suffer from that problem.
Right. With your equipment, what's the furthest object you've been able to observe or photograph out in space, as far as we know, anyways? The furthest.
So, yeah, the furthest would probably be this quasar that I got images of, and I think that was about 2 billion light years
Wow.
thereabouts. Yeah, I mean it's just a dot, granted, but
Right.
it's measured at about 2 billion light years based on the redshift. Closer in, it can still see, of course, a lot of different galaxies in the tens to hundreds of millions of light years distance, and see spiral details in the Whirlpool galaxy and things like that. It's been an interesting process, a learning process for me of
Oh, I'm
trying to
sure.
figure out the best way to take these pictures. Yeah, because I mean I've been doing astrophotography now for 18 years. Started out doing film astrophotography, just basic stuff, getting the moon, of course, and some pictures of like Saturn, but they were really terrible pictures. My film pictures of Saturn, they're overexposed, so you can't tell the difference between Saturn and the rings. It just looks like a giant oval,
Oh.
with some dots around it that are
Yeah.
the moons of Saturn. But as a high school student, I was like thrilled to get anything on
Oh
film.
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah,
But
Duck and Cover says here, can you point a refractor telescope towards the sun? I'm sure you can, but Do you observe the sun? You have to have a special special kind
Oh,
of dampener or something. Obviously, you can't just point it at the
oh
sun.
yeah. So you got to use safe filters. Don't try this at home if you
Yeah.
don't know what you're doing. And the bad thing with refractors, especially, like there were some older cruddy refractors they'd sell in the store. They would sell you a solar filter to come with the refractor, and think, oh, I can point this thing at the sun with this filter on there. It, these things were notoriously dangerous. They would
Ooh.
sell you a little filter that would screw onto the eyepiece.
Oh.
It wouldn't cover the front of the
Oh,
telescope. It would
that's
screw onto the
terrible.
eyepiece. Yeah, exactly. So you're concentrating sunlight on a tiny little piece of glass that is the only thing between you and concentrated sunlight is
Yeah.
this tiny little piece of glass that is itself getting cooked. If that thing overheated and then shattered, you're instantly blind. So really, really bad. You want to use a safe solar filter. I use 1,000 Oaks solar filter over the aperture of my Schmidt-Cassegrain when I'm doing white light imaging.
Okay.
So that's just basically it's just dimming the sun dramatically, way more than any normal filter. Of course, if you look at the filter itself, it looks like a piece of aluminum.
Wow.
It's a giant mirror. It reflects most of the light. It only lets a very, very tiny portion in to your eye or to the camera where it's safe. And even there, you have to be careful, because over time these things can degrade.
Yeah.
Especially like a Mylar filter. These are just like paper, like Mylar, that go over the front, and they are safe. But if they get a rip or a tear, you could be in trouble.
Yeah.
So that's why I use 1,000 Oaks, because it's basically glass, and so you can tell a lot easier, if you've got a problem. What you have to do is you have to hold these things up to what you want to do is take a bright 100-watt bulb, hold your filter over that bulb, and it should only let you see the very barest light of the filament, and you should be able to see any pinpricks of light where the filter is degraded. And what you want to do is you want to take a Sharpie marker and mark over those pinpoints to make sure that those are covered.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you don't want that to happen. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine. Yeah, going blind, that would be the worst case scenario.
Yeah, when I was in college, I worked at a public observatory that did a lot of outreach and stuff, and they would do solar viewing. And so there was an incident that happened before I started working there, and I can't believe these people did that and got away with what they did in terms of, because they would have the 1,000 Oaks filters on the front of the telescopes,
Okay.
and they would be showing these things actually at Disney. So I went to college in Orlando, and so they would take these things out to Disney World actually, and they would set them up for the kids to look through and
Oh,
stuff at
gosh.
Disney. And oh my God, I mean, you can already see where this is going, right? So there was a
Yeah.
kid who was looking through the telescope, watching the sun with a filter on the front, and his buddy comes over to the front of the telescope to grab the filter and rip it off, because he thinks this is going to be a real fun prank on his brother or whoever it was,
Oh
his friend.
gosh.
And my boss, who was working there, didn't have time to stop the kid going to the front of the telescope. So instead, she grabbed the kid who was looking through the telescope and yanked him off of it just before the filter came off, and shot concentrated sunlight
Wow.
through the eyepiece.
Freaking
So he
kids,
was
man.
within-
They're always ruining things, huh?
I know. Well,
Yeah, that
man,
would have
if
been
that-
terrible. Oh my gosh.
Oh my
Good
God! Can
thing
you
she
imagine
pulled
the
him.
lawsuit? Oh my
Yeah.
God!
Yeah.
It would have been bad for Disney. It would have been bad for the observatory. It would have been bad for everybody.
Terrible
I mean,
day
just
there.
just
Yeah.
awful. And not to mention the kid would have lost one of his eyes. So it's just awful. So from then on, they still do solar observing, but now they duct tape the filters to the front of the telescopes. Screw the paint job. Let's just make sure that these things are on there securely.
Yeah, don't fall off
Um,
or anything. Yeah.
One I would recommend, if you want to do solar observing and you want to be sure you're doing it safe, I would recommend getting a Solar Max or a Coronado PST, sort of an entry level. I've got a Coronado PST. It's a solar telescope that's all it does. It can only do solar observing. The filter is built into it, so you can't take it off. You can't screw it up. It's idiot proof.
Oh, okay, that's good.
And
Yeah.
it's really nice too. It's a hydrogen alpha filter, so it only lets light through at a very specific wavelength that corresponds to hydrogen alpha emissions, which show you the prominences and the solar flares in a lot
Wow.
more detail
Yeah.
than you can see.
Have
with
you
the-
have you videotaped any of that kind of footage?
A little bit. It's tricky with the PST. The personal solar telescope they sell is sort of like the entry level one. It's not really designed for photography.
Okay.
It's got a very short back focus, so it's hard to get a lot of cameras to come to focus with it.
Yeah.
I've done a little bit, and I'm not super thrilled by the results. It's actually nothing I've done does justice to what you see in the eyepiece. With your just your
Oh,
eyeball
I'm
in the
sure.
eyepiece, you actually see
Yeah.
a much better view. But that's something I'm still sort of
Yeah.
playing with. I'd like to get to better photography with hydrogen alpha for sure.
Yeah, I know a lot of people say, the photograph doesn't do it justice. It definitely is the case with a telescope. Man, the times I've had a telescope, I've seen the moon and maybe a couple planets, but probably nothing like what you see. How close can you actually get to seeing, like Jupiter and Saturn, some of these planets that are further away than, say, Mars?
Yeah, I mean, when it's a good time of year for it, when they're opposite the sun in the sky, they show up really well. You can easily see the Great Red Spot, the cloud bands on Jupiter. But if you get it at just the right excuse me, just the right time, you can actually get one of the Jupiter's Galilean moons blocking out the sun and actually
Wow.
casting an eclipse. You can actually see a dark spot on Jupiter from an eclipse being cast on its surface. I remember the first time I saw that, I was actually in college at the college observatory, and I was volunteering there. We used to do public outreach events, and I remember the first one of the early nights we were doing that. One of my first nights doing that, we saw that happening, and we didn't like we were just students. We didn't know what it was. None of us had ever seen that before. And I'm like, what the
Yeah.
heck is that? Is that a really intense storm? And we watched over the course of the night. We could tell it was moving over the surface of Jupiter, and eventually we realized, oh, it's being caused by one of the moons. So
Oh,
that was really cool, and
yeah.
you can get that. Um, with Saturn, of course, you can see the rings, and you can get the Cassini division, a gap in the rings, so you can see a fair bit of detail there. And actually, with the planets and with even deep space, photographs can sometimes show you a little more detail than you can see by eye, depending on how you do it. Now, if you just do it like a snapshot through the eyepiece, obviously you're not going to get the kind of detail you can see by eye. But if you do what they call lucky imaging, where you record video of Jupiter or Saturn or whatever it is you're looking at, and then you take it into the computer and you put it into a program like Registax, where it will take each of the video frames and it'll look at how distorted each frame is, and it'll only pick the best frames.
Oh, wow,
And
that's
so it'll take
nice.
sort of it's really nice. So it'll take the cream of the crop, and then it averages the cream of the crop. So it takes all the stack of the best frames, and it averages them together. It looks at each pixel value, aligns them, and runs an average on those pixel values. And so you end up with a very sharp image that basically cancels out the atmospheric distortion because it averages everything out that changed and only retains what stayed the same. And what stayed the same is the object itself,
Yeah.
Saturn or Jupiter. So you can actually end up seeing enough, as much detail as you could as if there was no atmosphere distorting your view. So you end up seeing more detail than you really could by eye. And in that way, you can get better images. With deep space, the human eye is unfortunately not that great for it because we don't have a way of collecting light for a long period of time and letting it build up in our retina. Our retina processes the light immediately. And so most of these galaxies are much too dim to see much detail by eye. And our color receptors in our eyes, the cones, aren't particularly sensitive. It's the rods cells in our eyes that are much more sensitive to faint light, and so you end up seeing colorblind when you look
Mm,
at deep space objects like galaxies and nebulas. Even the Orion Nebula, which is relatively bright, in most amateur telescopes you will not see hardly any color. If you start to see any color, usually it's the green because your
wow.
your green cones are a little more sensitive perhaps. It doesn't look red. The red cones in your eyes are really poorly sensitive. They're not that sensitive to light at that sort of illumination level, and so you don't tend to see the color. You miss out on that, and a lot of people are disappointed by that. Like they expect to see Hubble Space Telescope type pictures when they look
Right.
through their telescope, and
Yeah.
then they think, well,
Mhm.
man, I got a really crappy scope or something, and then they come to a much bigger scope and they see the same thing and maybe a little more detail, but still no color, and then they start to realize, okay, well, that's just how it is.
That's where
The problem is
astrophotography comes in, huh?
exactly, because the problem is if they come to your observatory and they didn't pay anything, well, at least they didn't pay anything. It didn't cost them anything, so you never hear any bitching about it.
Yeah.
But if they came to your observatory and they paid an entrance fee, they're coming to see a certain thing that they expect to see, and when they don't get it, sometimes they get irate. So
Yeah.
I will never ever work in that field again as a public outreach guy. I will not do that. I did that to myself in
Oh,
college.
did you?
Never
Oh,
again.
gosh.
Never again.
People are hard to
But yeah, you're
please.
right. That's where people give you a hard time like no tomorrow. And it was at the level where I was in charge of the telescopes, but I didn't have the authority to issue refunds. I think the higher ups did that intentionally.
Oh, gosh.
So,
Yeah, and they probably weren't around at the time.
no, of course not. I could tell you a ton of stories about that. That's for another night's discussion.
Sure.
But uh,
Yeah, so
yeah, no, you're right. though. That's
you ran a pretty big telescope then, huh? Or an observatory?
well, and again, this comes down to I had enough power there that I was supposed to make things run, but I didn't have enough power to decide how things were run.
Right.
So I would have made very different choices in terms of how that observatory was designed, to be honest.
Mhm.
They wanted a claim to fame that they could use for their PR department and stuff. And they didn't really care what it meant for the actual functionality of the observatory. So they wanted to be able to say they were the largest telescope in the state of Florida. Well, they couldn't do that because they couldn't afford that. I mean, actually, for a long time, the largest telescope in the state of Florida was privately owned by an amateur astronomer in
Wow.
Chiefland, Florida. He actually had a bigger telescope than any of the universities there for a while.
I've been on some
And-
subreddits. Some of these guys, they build some stuff, man. They got some spare
Oh,
money for
yeah.
this hobby. Man, they go all out, I'm sure.
Yeah, they really do. So this is, basically, they couldn't compete on that basis. And so they said, okay, well, what can we do? Well, we can build the largest refractor in the state of Florida. So long tube telescope, like I was saying, the problem with the lens up at the front, it doesn't bring all the colors to the same focus point. So you get color fringing. And they just had the same basic achromat design that you would have in any Walmart telescope. I mean, just really poor optical quality, to be
Yeah.
honest. I mean, it was made by a high-end company, but it's just an achromat. It's not well corrected. And so you get really severe color fringing even on Saturn and Jupiter, and you can see it right away. But it was the largest refractor in this. It was even more specific than that. It was the largest publicly accessible refractor in
All
the state
just
of
for
Florida.
a title, huh?
All just for a stupid title.
Jeez.
So you had this really long tube with this really high magnification on a mount that was on the top floor of a multi-story building that was not vibration isolated from the rest of the building, so it shook like a leaf in the wind and did not provide terribly great views. We actually had a larger telescope that was a 14-inch Celestron Schmidt-Cassegrain sitting in a closet where it was very rarely used because nobody felt like dragging it out, but it was actually a bigger telescope, and we didn't tell anyone about that. And it's just like, oh, guys, that is not what you should have spent. They spent $250,000 on this thing. It's like, why?
Wow.
Why did you do that?
Yeah. Jeez.
And they prided themselves on the gear system for this telescope. It was made by a company that's really good at making gears for astronomical mounts. You know, really
Right,
accurately
really
tuned
precise and
telescopes.
everything, yeah.
Really precise, yeah. But they never aligned it properly.
Oh, what?
The darn thing was out of from
geez.
day one that I worked there. It was out of alignment. They had never done a proper polar line because no one working there knew how to do it. I mean,
Man.
that's how bad it was. So I knew how to do it because I did it with my telescope all the time. But they never let me take the time to shut it down for a night to just do that. They always gave me something else to do. So when I finally left for my left my job there and got a much better job in a much better science, basically that was the last task. They said they realized this guy's the only guy who knows how to align this stupid thing, and we've never actually let him align it. All right, as your last job, Astro, we want you to go align the telescope. So that's the last thing I did there. The last night was sit there all night aligning that stupid telescope, and that was just like, wow. And so I never got to benefit from the fruits of my labors there, but yeah.
Oh, eventually you will, man. I think so. Got a guy in here, Astro Buzz, asking a question. Did Astromut ever go through the space camp program in Huntsville, Alabama? Did you ever go through any of those programs? I know I seen them when I was a kid. My parents were thinking about it once when I was a kid. I remember they had stuff like that around. They probably still do, I imagine, but
Oh yeah, as far as I know, Space Camp is still running in Huntsville. I haven't heard anything about them shutting down, but no, I never got to do Space Camp. They had a Space Camp when I was a kid. They had a Space Camp in Florida as well, near the Space Center. That actually shut down I don't know, at least a decade or more ago, and turned into just a museum. But if you ever see the movie Space Camp, that's where it's depicted as being in Florida.
Oh, okay.
I never got to do that. I did actually visit the Space Camp in Huntsville once on a family trip or something, but we just sort of passed through and took the tour. We didn't really do anything. I went there once. The one in Florida, I went there once on a field trip. Yeah, I mean, never really did the proper space camp experience. No.
So, one guy was asking about panspermia. What's your thoughts on that? I don't even know what the heck that is. I've heard of it before. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's an interesting theory. It's kind of difficult to prove. The idea is
Duck
that.
and Cover asked that, by the way. I got to give him a shout out for that because,
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's a big word
Yeah, I
for
mean,
me.
yeah. So basically, the idea is that life could be seeded through through ejection of material during collisions, and that it could seed other planets, even perhaps seeding other star systems, particularly if they're passing close to each other. Like you may have heard recently about this interstellar object they detected, Oumuamua, that came through our solar system, and they think it came from another solar system because it's the first time we've ever seen an object that was strongly hyperbolic, meaning it had an orbit that wasn't close to escape velocity of the sun. It was actually pretty well above escape velocity from the sun. Usually when a comet comes through, even if it's hyperbolic, meaning it's going to escape the sun and never come back, it's only slightly above escape velocity. It's like it got nudged just enough to be able to escape the sun.
Right.
This object was quite different in that it was well above escape velocity. It wasn't nudged. This thing seems to have come from the same direction that our solar system is traveling through interstellar space relative to other stars in our area. It's called the solar apex. And if you look at where the solar apex is projected out onto the sky, that's where this object seemed to come from. So it's like when you're driving down the road and it's raining and the raindrops look like they're coming towards your windshield, it's like that's what it felt like with this object coming towards us. And it was also weirdly shaped. It was very elongated.
Yep, I remember it. Yeah, a lot of people are saying it was a cigarette UFO. They just flew right through. It kind of looked like a rod almost, maybe. That kind of shape, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, there's a theory out there that, if you get objects like that passing through your solar system, if one of them is harboring life and maybe, really, really rugged life, like a spore or some sort of extremophile that can survive inside the rock, if it hits your planet and breaks free, maybe it can seed life on that planet if there isn't already life there. So we know there are life forms that can survive in the vacuum of space for surprisingly long periods of time.
Yeah.
Water bears are quite famous for being able to do that. You can expose them to the hard vacuum of space and the radiation, and then bring them back to Earth and put them back in the water, and they wake right back up and they go back doing what they do. And there's other microbes as well that can form spores, and those spores can survive all kinds of intense conditions that normal microbes wouldn't be able to survive. So it's possible that maybe, we could be seeding Mars, or Mars could have seeded us with life, depending on which planet established life first. Because there are asteroids that arrive to us from Mars, actual material from the Martian surface that it got ejected in an impact, and it's landed here, and we've looked at it and analyzed it, and it's got the same gas composition that we see in rocks on Mars with our rovers. So we know it seems to have come from Mars, and so if that's true, could something have survived in one of those rocks? Now, there was discovery of what looked like structures resembling fossilized microbes in one of those Martian rocks. And you might remember back in the 90s, Bill Clinton announced it. There was a whole media to-do about it, about finding evidence of alien life on Mars in this Martian meteorite.
Yeah, I kind of remember something like that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, that suggests that maybe life could survive a trip on a rock like that. Now, unfortunately, if your rock is ejected off your planet and you happen to be a microbe inside of it, chances are that rock hasn't been precisely targeted for any particular location. So it's going to drift around in space for a long, long time before it finally comes down somewhere. So there's a real question as to whether any life even a hardened spore or water bear or whatever
Right.
could survive that length of time, potentially millions of years in space before it finally comes down on a planet it could be capable of inhabiting. But who knows? Maybe it's an interesting theory. Like I said, it's difficult to prove. There's some
Definitely.
scientists who are on the fringes who are trying to prove it, looking at things like collecting high altitude air samples and seeing what microbes they find, seeing if any of them basically don't find a match with anything on Earth and have weird DNA or something like that that might indicate that they actually came from another planet and they're surviving in our upper atmosphere.
Wow. You've probably looked into the sky a lot. I'm guessing more than I have. That's just a honest guess, but have you ever seen anything you can't explain? Have you ever seen anything weird looking up in the sky at all?
Well, sort of. So I was actually live broadcasting a partial solar eclipse a few years ago when suddenly I was taken by surprise. I saw this object starting to pass through the field of view from left to right, and it looked weird. I thought at first maybe it's some sort of aircraft, but it wasn't really moving at the right speed, and
Wow.
it also didn't look quite right. And it appeared to be shape shifting a little bit. The shape didn't seem to be consistent, and I followed it until it left the sun. Now, in hindsight, the size of the object is consistent with it possibly being a bundle of balloons that were tied together. There was an island that I was looking out over a bay, and on the opposite side of that bay was a an island with some resorts and stuff. And there's sort of a party atmosphere over there, so it's possible somebody could have let off some balloons and it passed over the sun. When the sunset actually occurred that day, I saw it sort of going down behind some buildings. I mean, there's definitely inhabited stuff over there on that island that
Right.
maybe somebody could have let off a balloon. So I can't rule that out.
Right. Yeah.
But
That could
but it
definitely be
was
the
it was weird,
possibility.
and
Did you
you know
capture that on the live stream?
I did. It was on the live stream, and I reacted to it on the live stream. Like, what is that? I was honestly taken surprised by it, and I tried to do the best I could to test my balloon hypothesis. I was going to deliberately set up a balloon and shoot with the telescope over a long distance,
Oh,
and try to
okay.
see what the balloon looked like silhouetted against the sun.
Yeah.
But I ran into some trouble there. My car got rear-ended twice in a week.
What?
Yeah,
Dang.
once was just a fender bender bumper. I had the I had the balloons in my car with my telescope, and I was going to go out and test this theory. And
Oh,
some guy, I was
jeez.
at a stoplight, he bumps me hard enough that it jerked me around. It startled me, and so we pull off to the side, and he takes off before he gives me his information.
Ah,
And he's in a
asshole.
black car.
Oh,
I don't.
Men in
So
Black, people. Watch out.
Men in Black, Men in Black. Now he was wearing a yellow shirt though, so I don't
Oh,
know. He was definitely
Men in
not in the
Yellow.
black.
Those are the men in
But
yellow. You don't have to worry about them.
yeah, don't have to worry too much about them. Very cowardly, just driving off without giving me his information. Fortunately, he didn't do any damage to the car, but it turned out in the end it didn't matter because in less than a week, I was rear-ended again. This time I
Jeez.
wasn't deliberately driving to test this theory. I was just driving back to my home at the time, and I was turning left into my apartment complex, and out of nowhere, a black truck comes behind me and clips me really hard. Basically, it was a teen driver. She was probably texting and driving. I don't know that for sure, but she obviously wasn't paying attention because had my blinker on. I was about to turn left. She turns at the very last second. Thank goodness.
Oh, you actually
Because
use
otherwise,
you actually use your blinker, huh? You're a smart man. We don't see
yeah, I
that
know.
too much nowadays.
Yeah, unfortunately, between my brake lights and my blinker, somehow it still didn't help. She
No.
didn't notice until the last second. So she clipped my car hard enough that it totaled the car. Fortunately, she didn't slam straight into me because it probably would have sent me to the hospital. She went off in the ditch and ended up wrapping the front end of her truck around a tree.
Wow.
That was the only thing that stopped her from going into a house. And
Jeez.
uh,
Man.
yeah, unfortunately, my car was old enough that even with the amount of damage that was done, it was enough that it totaled out the car. So I had to get a new car. So my telescope was actually in the trunk at that time, and
Yeah,
it
that's what I
was
was going to ask you.
Yeah, I got real lucky. That telescope was nearly destroyed. It came within about an inch of its life because
Oh, wow.
she just barely missed taking that out.
I'm
And
sure you
like I said,
carry that in a pretty big case too, I imagine. Probably something protective.
Yeah, it's got a big foam case. It's not. It couldn't survive that kind of impact for sure.
Right.
And really the only reason I had it in there is because I'd recently been trying to test this hypothesis. Well, obviously that caused a fair bit of annoyance and distraction for me. So I ended up never really following up on that. At that point, it was like, and I had to admit to myself, what are the odds that I see this weird thing, and then like within a week I'm hit twice, and then the second time it totals my car, even if it's not the Men in Black. Maybe God's trying to tell me something here.
Right.
I'm just gonna drop this one. You know what? Even if it's aliens, it's not worth my life. I'm just gonna let this one go.
Yeah. Speaking of aliens, I guess I don't know. What's your thoughts on all that? Obviously, it's like we talked about with the panspermia thing. It's probable, right? There's possibilities, but what's your thoughts on
I mean, my personal opinion. This is my personal opinion. I can't prove anything about aliens, but I personally believe they're out there.
Yeah.
I think, given what we know now, especially with all the exoplanet data we have, we know there's a lot of planets out there around other stars. Some of the systems are configured very differently than ours, and that may not bode well for life in those systems. But there's others that could host life, and we have found terrestrial-sized planets in the habitable zones of their parent stars. So it's possible that there could be life that similar to ours, that's in some of those systems. There could also be life in very inhospitable environments, places like Europa and Enceladus and some of these moons of Jupiter and Saturn, where we believe there's subsurface oceans that could be even more vast than the oceans on Earth. And where there's water, and where there's water and where there's chemical energy, we know on Earth at least there's life. So it makes sense there could be life down there too. It may not be, advanced intelligent life. Then again, who knows? Maybe like the movie Abyss, maybe there's an intelligent civilization down there. We just don't know.
Under the sea, the mermaids.
Right. Yeah, they could be minding their business down there. We would be none the wiser. Yeah. But just even in considering Earth-like planets hosting Earth-like life, we know there are possibilities out there, and I can't help but think that given the number of solar systems out there, and even just our galaxy, let alone all the others, there's bound to be somebody out there, I would think.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that although I've never seen, a flying disc or anything like that, I do have close family who has witnessed a silver disc with windows flying close enough to their car that they could see through the windows and see the wall on the opposite side. And this was during the space race era, before I was born. Early space race era, around Project Mercury time frame.
Kind of when
thereabouts.
It was all getting pretty heavy too, as far as UFO sightings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this was near the Space Center. This was within 15 minutes of Cape Canaveral. So in that time frame, back in the early 1960s, late 1950s, that's when this sighting occurred. And I have no reason to doubt them. I have no reason to think that they're lying to me. They certainly saw something they can't explain, and they grew up right next to an airport. My late grandfather was a pilot and had a plane, and he would park his plane at their house. They just had like an overhang area where he would keep the plane, and he would wheel it across the street onto the airport. This is before they had fences around airports.
Yeah, or TSA or anything, yeah.
Or any TSA or anything, yeah. So he would just wheel his taxi service airplane onto the local airport and take off.
Heck yeah.
So, they were very familiar with flying machines in the area, and this didn't look like any of those.
I want to confuse them any to see something, yeah.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't explain that, and for a long time I was a big fan of Roswell type stuff. I went to made a special point to make sure we stopped at Roswell when we were traveling one time, and got a signed copy of the Majestic 12 documents signed by Stanton T. Friedman. So
wow,
I was a big fanboy of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, that brings me to my next question then for you. Trump and the Space Force. What do you think's going on there? A lot of people think that we already have a Space Force, that it's just classified. I
mean,
what's your thoughts on that?
So it's probably not a popular opinion, and again, this is my opinion, but right. I think that there's definitely a secret Space Force, but it's probably not as exciting as people would like to think. I mean, when people just consider the regular military, when people think about whatever it is, like the Navy, life in the Navy, oh, you're going to be an exciting Navy
Yeah.
sailor and go
See
do a
the
bunch of
world.
see the world, and go do all kinds of cool shit and blow shit up. Well, there's a decent chance you're going to end up on a boat where you're basically scrubbing the toilets. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a lot of mundane jobs
Definitely.
and a lot of mundane stuff that goes on out there,
And they're
a
promoted
lot of
with
your
that
day.
right there. It's exciting. You're gonna be at the, Taj
Mhm.
Mahal and in Paris. No.
Yeah, a lot of it is paperwork. A lot of it is just boring ass stuff you wouldn't want to be bothered with. And I think the same is probably true for the secret space force, because we've had a secret space force for years, but it's been heavily focused on things like early warning systems, missile detection, defense systems, and there could be some really exciting stuff with that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, just think about the ability of putting up a satellite that has a laser so powerful it could take out a missile while it's still launching before it can, deploy its nuclear payload and all that stuff. I mean, to me, that stuff's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But to most people, they say, well, that's just the public stuff they want you to know. Well, honestly, even that, they don't really tell us much about that. There's probably advanced technologies there that we don't know about, that don't necessarily involve soldiers in space,
Yeah.
but still involve, classified stuff. Like right now, SpaceX is competing for Air Force contracts to launch certain satellites, but there's certain satellites they can't launch. Reason being, they integrate their payloads horizontally. They integrate their payloads and put the rocket together
I thought you
in the
were gonna
horizontal
say
position.
I thought you were gonna say they couldn't do it because Elon Musk smoked pot. So.
Well, that's a possibility too. I heard they were looking into that, actually.
Yeah,
They
looking
were
into that.
there.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
just got to go to a YouTube link to look into that one.
I know. So, like with some of the other rockets, like Delta and Atlas, they integrate the rockets vertically. They put the payloads on in the vertical position. And strangely, there's some Air Force payloads that are required to be integrated vertically. They can't be assembled horizontally. Why?
Oh, okay.
Why can't you put it together? What could possible reason could you have? Is there an alien egg in there and you can't tip it over? I mean, what the hell's going on there? I don't know. I'm not saying there is. I'm just saying there's something
right.
there.
I get what you're
that
saying.
we
Yeah,
don't-
that's weird.
Like, I can't think of a single civilian payload that has
Yeah.
that requirement. Correct me if I'm wrong. Someone in the chat, correct me if I'm wrong. Show me a civilian payload that requires vertical integration as opposed to horizontal integration. This is why SpaceX is dominating the market. There are no civilian payloads that require vertical integration, because otherwise SpaceX couldn't launch them. But guess what? Everyone's launching with SpaceX these days because they're cheaper, and they don't care that they're horizontal integration because civilian payloads don't have a problem with that. But for some reason, certain classified military payloads are required to be integrated vertically. So there
That's
are
crazy.
classified payloads out there right now,
Yeah.
and like amateurs track these things. Like we track classified payloads all the time. Publicly, their orbits are not supposed to be known. They don't publish that information, and to some of the amateurs, that's concerning. Not just because of, well, what are they hiding? It's concerning because you could have potential debris issues, collision issues, where publicly they're not allowed to say that you're potentially going to come into contact with this object. So amateurs will track these things, and there's a large catalog of classified payloads. In fact, I wrote some software recently for predicting when any given satellite will pass over the sun or the moon as seen from a given location on Earth. And the reason I did that was so I could run through with the classified orbital information that amateurs actually maintain and keep. I could run that file through that program and predict every single classified payload that we know about that's going to be passing over the sun or moon in the
How
next
many
week
are
or
there?
2 weeks. Geez, there's
Just
hundreds,
generally.
I think.
Hundreds?
I mean,
Wow.
at least I'd have to look at the file to look at the total number, but it's huge. It's
Wow.
huge. It just keeps going and going.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of them are redundant. You'll see a lot of NOS satellites very frequently. Those are kind of fun. There are these Navy observational satellites that are supposedly used to track submarines in the ocean and stuff, and they fly in formation. There's actually 2 or 3 of them at a time that will fly in formation with each
Wow.
other. So if you
That's
watch, you
pretty
can see a
cool.
giant triangle in the sky, and most people look at that and say, "Oh, there it is. There's the
Yeah.
TR3B. There's the
Yeah.
triangle." And no, actually, it's a NOS.
That's interesting.
Formation.
Yeah, because you see a lot of satellites in the night sky. I know I have. And, you see them flying at night, and they're reflecting the sunlight. And I haven't seen any in formation though. That would be cool. That'd be cool.
Yeah, if you look it up, NOS satellites will fly in formation. There's also some non-military satellites that do that for scientific reasons. What is it? MMT. I could be messing up the acronym there, but there's a magnetospheric mission that is studying the Earth's magnetosphere, and there's actually 4 satellites that fly in a pyramid formation in orbit, and it's really cool to see them.
Yeah. Can you see it with the naked eye? Does it look like a normal? No.
No, unfortunately not. I got the name wrong. What is it? MMS? Yeah, MMS. Sorry, MMS. Magnetospheric Multi-Scale Mission is the name of the mission.
Wow.
So they fly 4 of these satellites in pyramid formation. Unfortunately, like I say, you can't see them by eye. They're too high in altitude and not big enough to see by eye. So you have to track them with a telescope like mine. So you don't see images of them very often for that reason. But I do have a couple time-lapse videos on my YouTube channel where you can see them flying in formation.
Yeah.
Initially, when they were launched, they were just sort of flying in a line. But more recently, I've tracked them, and they are in this pyramid formation, which is really
cool.
wild.
That would be cool to see. Yeah. So I guess just saying that there are classified things in orbit, that is a secret space force right there. I don't know if you could classify it as a force, I guess, but I think the way Trump's talking is like another branch of the military where we have, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the reason, so some of the reasons for doing that would be basically integrating multiple programs that are currently spread out over the various service branches. So the Navy will have their own satellites, like the NOS satellites. Yeah. The Army will have their own satellites. The Air Force will have even more satellites of their own, and they won't necessarily all talk to each other.
They get along.
Yeah, some of their capabilities may be redundant, and so it makes sense for efficiency and everything else, and for I would suppose probably situational awareness, bringing that into one house, and so that everything, the left hand's talking to the right hand, and nothing slips through the cracks. It makes a lot of sense, I think, in that way.
Yeah.
It may not be as exciting as troops on the moon, but maybe we'll get there. Maybe we'll get there.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that we love about SpaceX, right?
Absolutely.
Elon Musk. And do you know John Carmack? Do you know John Carmack? Do you follow him at all?
I know people who know John Carmack. I've never met him.
He's a cool guy. I haven't met him either. I'm just saying. You know who he is then.
Oh yeah, definitely. So I've done work with a group called Exos Aerospace. I was out with them for their latest launch just a few weeks ago in New Mexico. They were actually originally formed by John Carmack as Armadillo Aerospace. And then they folded that operation up, but reopened as Exos Aerospace. So John Carmack's no longer directly involved.
Okay.
But it's the people he hired that are basically running this really cool group of guys. So they're launching suborbital vehicles and making them reusable, similar to SpaceX, but a little different approach. So I've been doing some work with those guys.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. For those listening, John Carmack, he started that Doom video game, right? Was it Doom? It was Doom, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and he worked with Palmer Luckey to create that Oculus VR headset. And he's a talented guy, very talented guy, but he's really big into rocketry and space and stuff. So, yeah, I know he's got to be involved in some of this, definitely.
I think he still keeps in touch with some of the Exos guys, but he's technically not like in charge of their operation anymore. He's got his own stuff that he's doing, obviously now with Oculus and everything.
Right. Yeah. He's kind of working on that.
Mm-hmm,
Which is a cool headset. I have one of those. They're pretty neat. You do the space thing.
Oh, I do too.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah.
What's that space one called? The Titans? The Titans? That's pretty cool.
Yeah. If you look up online, Armadillo Aerospace, there's some really cool videos for anyone who hasn't seen them, showing these vertical takeoff, vertical landing rockets that they were doing even before SpaceX was doing it. Just sort of lander tests and stuff. Really cool stuff.
Yeah, when was the first one successfully done as far as launching and then landing? It seems like it wasn't too long ago. It seems like, man, we should have been doing this a lot sooner. It seems like we've had the capability to do it a lot sooner. I don't know. I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, no, that's probably very true. So, was it Orbcomm, I think, was the first landing. When was that? And then the CRS-8 mission was the first landing on the boat, and I was actually at that one for a NASA social. That was
Oh
2016.
yeah, I remember that one. Yeah. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's only 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. It was not that long ago, and like I said, I was there that day. I got to see that rocket up close just before it took off, fortunately, and then afterwards, I got to be there right next to Elon Musk as he was giving his post-flight
Oh.
press briefing. I was in the room for that press briefing, just about 6 feet away from him, sitting on the floor.
Oh.
You couldn't see me. I was just beneath the camera, but I was right there on the floor, staring up at Elon Musk while I was giving that talk.
Have you ever talked with him at all, or shook his hand, met him?
I waved at him, and he kind of waved back at the rest of us,
Yeah.
all waving at him, but I didn't really shake his hand or anything.
Well, it's awesome that he's done, what he's done with SpaceX, and the stuff that's going on now in the news with the SEC. It's just, I don't know, it's weird, especially after Joe Rogan's podcast. That all seemed to kind of escalate after then. And the SEC and his tweets and the tweets about what was going on overseas with when he was sending a submarine over there with that one guy he was calling a pedophile, and then the tweets that the SEC said it's just a shame to see it all happen, because he is a talented guy, and he seems to be doing some things that could bring really good things about for all of us, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, I think he's a really positive force on a lot of these industries, and he's SpaceX is the reason other companies are scrambling for reusable vehicles. I can't speak to Tesla too much. I'm not a car guy so much, but at least in terms of SpaceX, he's revolutionized the space industry in general, not just with his rockets,
Definitely.
but now they're talking about phasing out the Atlas V, the venerable Atlas V that has never had a failure, because they need to be able to make their rockets reusable, because they just can't compete.
How could
they can't compete
Couldn't.
with SpaceX? Yeah, they can't. So they're talking about doing this Vulcan rocket now, and they just announced that Blue Origin, another company developing reusable rockets,
Who started that?
is
that?
That's Jeff Bezos. That's Bezos.
That's right, Bezos.
Amazon.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So Amazon's Jeff Bezos, his company, is going to be building the engines for ULA. ULA is United Launch Alliance. They build the Atlas V and Delta IV. So they are like the old space guys. The guy Boeing and Lockheed, these guys that have been in the space industry since the space race.
Oh yeah.
They aren't even building their own engines at this point. They're turning to Jeff Bezos to build engines that can be reused and to power their next version of their rocket, because they need to catch up with Elon Musk. And so the way they're doing that is they're trying to purchase the engines from Jeff Bezos. That's how desperate they are.
Dang. Wow. It's almost like we might have another space race on our hands, huh? Do you think? Or maybe not so much.
Oh, we definitely do.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily about – a lot of people are looking at, sort of the tangible targets of the moon or Mars, but there's an even more fundamental space race within the industry itself.
Yes.
To see who can win the reusable launch market in the future. And they're all three of the big players in America are currently gunning for that. SpaceX is obviously gunning for it. Blue Origin is going to be gunning for it. Right now they've just been using the New Shepard rocket for their suborbital space tourism, but they are developing a orbital rocket for launching satellites called New Glenn. And they're going to be funding that development by selling the engines to ULA. So you got this weird sort of symbiotic relationship where Blue Origin is going to be getting money by selling engines to the old standard ULA company, and they're going to be building their new rocket. And their crazy idea for reusability for ULA is, well, we can't really do the SpaceX thing. We don't have the time or the money to develop rockets that can fly back and land. So you know what we'll do? We'll just kick the engines off the rocket and then parachute them down, and then we'll catch them with a helicopter before they hit the ocean.
What?
I'm not joking. This is their brilliant plan. They call it smart reuse, which I think is a joke.
Who's going to fly the helicopter?
Anything smart about exactly? What's so smart about flying a helicopter
Oh
underneath
my gosh.
a giant freaking set of engines and catching it in midair and then towing it back to land?
How do they plan on catching it though? With the helicopter, they got some kind of netting system?
A hook, I guess. I mean, like,
wow.
I've heard about. It's actually not the craziest idea. It's been done before. It's actually been done since early space race days. The old Corona satellites used to do this thing where they would take film pictures, because they didn't really have the kind of digital cameras we have now. So for the spy satellites, they would take film pictures They would eject the film into these reentry capsules, and then they would re-enter the atmosphere with the film inside the capsule. And then a helicopter would catch it over the desert before it hit the desert floor. They wanted to do that to make sure that they had an unbroken chain of custody of the film, to make sure the Soviets didn't sneak out into the desert, swap out the film, and then sneak away before they could recover it in the middle of the desert. So they would catch it. They would actually catch it midair so that they would be able to recover it.
Wow.
And NASA even did that somewhat successfully here and there, or tried to. Although one of their missions, I forget which one of them failed, where they tried to catch a reentry capsule with a helicopter, and it actually slammed into the desert floor and exposed the sample to the air.
Just explaining that sounds like a failure, catching this falling thing with a helicopter. Man.
I know. I mean, it's very, and I can tell you right now what it is the executive, I could be wrong about this, but I think what it is the engineers and executives at ULA, they are old school guys. I mean, if you look at the average age of these guys, they're much older than SpaceX or Blue Origin. And so they have an old school mentality. These guys were looking, most of them were probably working back in the old space race days. So they remember doing this with Corona and whatnot.
Yeah,
so they probably just relied on, they're probably just relying on what they know. They say, you know what we know how to do? We know how to catch stuff in midair with a helicopter while it's on a parachute. That's what we'll do. That's smart. So that's their big plan. But of course, they're not going to do that right away. The first X number of launches are going to be fully expendable, where they just chuck the rocket away like before. But they're promising, I swear to you, investors, invest in us, because one day we will get our engines back. We'll toss the rest of the rocket, but we'll get the engines back, and those are the really expensive parts.
I wonder why can't they just land them in the ocean, though, with a parachute, maybe a balloon system like they did with the lunar module. Was it the lunar module they did that? Or most of them, then they came back to from space, right?
Right.
And some of them landed in the ocean.
Yeah, the capsules would land. Yeah, the capsules would land in the ocean, and generally those were not reused. Those were one time only. Because the problem is the salt water is really bad for those electronic parts, and especially for liquid fueled engines. You've got really complex and really delicate plumbing in these engines, and so if you expose those to salt water, you're immediately ruining them. You'll never fly them again. With the shuttle solid rocket boosters, those are kind of big dumb boosters. They're basically just giant metal casings that you pour solid fuel into and you ignite it.
Wow.
So there's not as much going on there. There's still some stuff, don't get me wrong, there's still some electronics and stuff in there, but it's not nearly as bad. And so they were able to land the solid rocket boosters from the shuttle in the ocean and recover those and reuse them. So people think of that, they remember that, and they're like, well, why don't you just do that? Well, the problem is you can't really do that with a liquid fueled engine. It's not practical. SpaceX toyed with the idea at first, but they quickly realized that was not going anywhere. So that's why they started practicing and then executing their propulsive landings using the engines to actually fly back and land.
Yeah, they do a great job too. I know you were speaking about somebody you knew that had seen a flying saucer type thing close to where they launched some of these spacecraft. You know, I remember watching the one SpaceX rocket that did blow up on the platform. I'd seen a video on that, and something flew by right before it blew up. They were saying it was a UFO that shot a laser beam at it. It looked kind of just like a bird, honestly. But
yeah, it probably was.
Yeah, it definitely did. But that was a terrible one right there. Were you there for that one at all, or?
No, but I'll tell you this: I was on the other side of the state where I currently live, but my family lives over there still, and I get a call from my mom. She's like, "Do you know anything about a launch or anything today?" I'm like, "No, I think SpaceX was doing an engine test." She's like, "I heard a loud boom." Oh. Yeah, she heard it. It shook the house.
Wow. Okay, so they were just testing it at that time. I didn't know if that was a launch or what.
Yeah, it was supposed to be just an engine test. And there again, this is what worries me is you see it with NASA, and you also see it with SpaceX sometimes, where they get complacent about safety and they overestimate the safety margin of their rocket. And they put the satellite on the rocket. Now, granted, they offered the customer who was trying to launch the satellite the opportunity to take the payload off for that test. They said, okay, you can either leave the payload on for the test.
Wow.
We'll charge you less because we have to do less work. We don't have to take it on, put it off, take it on, put it off,
Yeah.
But if you want us to take it off, we'll do that, but it's going to cost you some extra money. And the customer opted not to do that. So they were just doing an engine test where they test fire the engines to make sure everything is working, and then they defuel, detank the vehicle, and just bring it back down and wait another day for launch. But it's just a pre-launch engine test they always do.
Okay.
And at the time, like I said, they offered the customers the chance to take the payloads off, but they never took that option because it was always more money. Well, it bit them in the butt that day when it blew up the rocket and took out the satellite. And in fact, in the last, I think, week or so, the news came out that the company, it's a bit complicated, but the company basically that was supposed to be managing that satellite has basically pulled the contract away from the company that was supposed to be overseeing the build and launch of the satellite. So, in essence, SpaceX will not be launching any more of that company's satellites, which, I mean, can you blame them? Not really.
No.
So, that
don't blame
news
them at all.
Yeah, don't blame it at all. That news came out last week, but now it is standard procedure. SpaceX will always take the payload off the rocket when testing it, so that if it blows up, at least the satellite's not lost.
Yeah. This guy, Duck and Cover, asks, has Dr. Astro heard of any alternative means of propulsion that might be feasible? And I can lead into that with, you probably know about the EM drive. Have you heard anything recently about that?
Yeah, I heard some not good news about that. I forget the details. I wish I could remember, but there was a paper published. At first, there was a paper published that seemed positive, where they EagleWorks lab at NASA seemed to indicate that they saw signs of thrust from this device.
Right.
Basically, a big microwave cavity. You turn it on, microwaves bounce around inside the cavity, and somehow magic happens. You get thrust.
Yeah.
More recently, some critiques were done of that paper, and some critiques were done of the EM drive in general. And gosh, I wish I could remember, but I think they found an explanation for the thrust that had nothing to do with what the EM drive was supposed to be. And basically, the upshot of it is that it would not work in space. I mean, I think it would still be cool to see it tested just to make sure. Grab a small.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, get a CubeSat or something. I don't know if it's probably not even feasible, but like a miniature microwave on a CubeSat with one of these things. Just see if it goes anywhere. Probably doesn't, but, interesting test.
Yeah, I was a subscriber to that subreddit for a while. I think it was just EM Drive, and I went back there recently just to check up. It'd been a while, and it was a post by the moderator that said, "This is over. It's done. It's no longer go away." But for those listening, that was something a lot of people were checking out. Have you heard of anything else as far as alternative means of propulsion that you think might be something more lucrative than that?
Well, there's once you get, the big problem is getting out of Earth's gravity well, getting into orbit. Once you get to orbit, a lot of options open up, and there's a lot of interesting technologies that are going to be tested soon. There's going to be, I think, another solar sail test coming up on the next Falcon Heavy, I think.
That's an interesting concept there, solar sails. That's definitely something cool.
Yeah, and there's derivatives of that as well that are kind of cool. The idea of trying to send an interstellar probe that's really lightweight, but with a gigantic solar sail, and shooting a laser at it from Earth to sort of propel this solar sail.
Yeah, that's like the Crookes radometer, right? I got one of those in my house. I do that actually with the laser. It's fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, no, that would be really, really cool. The idea of trying to get at least a micro satellite of some sort to Alpha Centauri in our lifetimes,
Right. Yeah.
That would be amazing. There's other ideas for, plasma drives, VASMR, ion thrusters of various types. And that's something the military's played with for a long time, dating back to the space race era. The military was already starting to play with. I believe they were playing with Hall effect thrusters and sort of these electric propulsion ideas for trying to keep their spy satellites up for longer periods of time than if they'd used chemical propulsion. And I know the Soviets got real crazy. They were playing with nuclear reactors in orbit.
Wow. Yeah.
A lot of people don't know this. There's actually a number of nuclear reactors in orbit. And when I was doing a search on this is not to get off subject, but the Sunspot Observatory thing in New Mexico.
That's not off subject. We had a few people asking. They wanted me to ask you about that, so go ahead.
one of the first things that popped. So I ran my new software for predicting solar and lunar transits of various satellites. You can load any file you want containing orbital elements of satellites, whether they're classified satellites or not, through this program, and it will tell you exactly which satellites are going to be passing over the sun or the moon and when. And one of the things that first popped out is in terms of satellites passing over the sun was a nuclear reactor that had been ejected from a Soviet satellite. So these crazy Soviet satellites, when they reached their end of life, they didn't want the nuclear material falling back to Earth. So the answer was apparently just to delay the inevitable, so the reactor would eject and move to a higher orbit. Basically, just shoot it up higher so it doesn't come back for a very long time.
Frickin' Russians.
Frickin' Russians. That'll be our grandkids' problem. At least we don't have to deal with it.
That's messed up. Wow.
There's still nuclear reactors floating around in orbit right now.
That's crazy. That's another thing I didn't know. I'm learning some things tonight, man. Wow. That's nuts. How many of those do you think are up there?
Oh, probably dozens. I don't know. I
right.
mean, there's a number of them.
Definitely.
There was a whole program of Soviet satellites that used nuclear power for their stupid radar satellites or whatever, where they needed a lot of electricity for their radar, and then for whatever reason they decided, yeah, we don't really want to do the whole giant solar array thing. That's annoying. Let's just put a nuclear reactor in it and call it good. We're Russians. We can do that. So, nothing bad ever happens when you put a Russian to work building a reactor, right? Nothing bad ever comes of that.
Just some vodka, yeah.
And actually, something bad did come of this one time. There was as I recall, and I'm working off memory here, so I could be getting some of the details wrong. I apologize. But I believe there was a Soviet nuclear satellite that came down. It did not eject properly. It did not eject the reactor properly. It stopped responding to commands, as I remember, and it did come down over Canada. And I think it dropped a crap load of plutonium and stuff all over Canada, I want to say.
Wow.
Man, yeah, it was.
That's just
Canada.
It was
a messy cleanup.
Sorry, I'm just kidding. Sorry, Canadians listening. Sorry. It was just a joke.
Yeah, it was messy cleanup. Yeah, here we go. This is from Wikipedia. Cosmos 954. Launched in 1977, and the malfunction prevented it from separating its nuclear reactor. And then it scattered radioactive debris over northern Canada.
Jeez.
And had to be cleaned up in a massive operation known as Operation Morning Light. How nice.
Morning Light, wow, that's curious.
Yeah.
That sucks. Wow.
Yeah, it was only up there about a year. It actually re-entered in 1978, so there you go. Well done.
So just going back up for a minute, what is your thoughts on Sunspot, New Mexico, as far as all that? Kind of weird situation, huh?
Yeah, I mean that was an interesting mystery there, and people were debating various ideas. There was a double eclipse that occurred on the Solar Dynamics Observatory on September 9th, just a few days after the closure occurred. So the moon passed over the sun. And then, due to the Solar Dynamics Observatory's orbit, it's in a geosynchronous orbit around the Earth, not geostationary, but geosynchronous, meaning it completes one orbit in one day, but it does not stay in one spot. It sort of completes this number 8 shaped ground
like
track
an infinity
over
loop
the Earth,
type thing, yeah.
like an infinity loop, yeah, because it's got an inclination to its orbit.
Okay.
So, it's got a geosynchronous orbit, and because of that orbit, the moon appeared to reverse direction and went over the sun a second time about 6 hours later, or thereabouts. And so that freaked a lot of people out, because they're like, well, if this was the moon, what the hell was the other thing? Because it was a different size, because the distance between the satellite and the moon had changed, and it was in a different direction because of the retrograde motion caused by the orbit. And you can look it up if you want. Like, there's a whole subject about retrograde motion. The ancients had trouble with the planets, charting the planets in the night sky and trying to predict retrograde motion, because the same thing actually occurs with us going around the sun and the other planets going around the sun,
right?
Just on a much longer scale. But it occurred here in the space of a few hours. The moon reversed direction, went back over the sun, freaked people out. They said, well, maybe this is the reason they shut down Sunspot Observatory. They didn't want them seeing Nibiru going over the sun. Well, turns out, like I said, it was just the moon, and you can use the orbital elements of the spacecraft And knowing where the moon is supposed to be in its orbit around the Earth, you can predict that exact event happening. So that inspired me to create a new YouTube bot that does this automatically. So from now on, I've got a bot running 24 hours a day, running once a day, generating predictions of when future eclipses will occur. And it will upload a video to YouTube showing and illustrating what that eclipse will look like. And it does successfully calculate and predict that September 9th event. If you load that date into it, it says, okay, here's what should happen. The moon should go over the sun. And then guess what? It should go over the sun again, opposite direction, a little bit smaller in size. And it will actually then take, once the event has happened, it will take the actual video from SDO and annotate it. It will overlay circles of where it expects the sun, the Earth, and the moon to be in the image so that you can see how well it matched up with reality.
Yeah.
And generated a video annotating that event, and sure enough, it was a perfect match. So nothing unusual there. So it definitely wasn't that. And to hopefully prevent that kind of confusion in the future, I've set up this dedicated YouTube channel.
Yeah, what is that YouTube channel? We can go ahead and give it to people.
Yeah, annotated SDO. It's 2 words.
Okay.
Yeah, annotated SDO. That's the YouTube channel. I can post the link in the chat if you want.
Yeah, we'll put it in the description too. That way people know.
Okay.
That's awesome. So as far as you being a talented astronomer, you sound like a talented software engineer too. I don't even know how I begin to do something like that. My gosh.
It's not. I'm not professionally trained in any kind of software engineering or computer science. It's totally self-taught, just like it is with astronomy with me. But I do use it as a means to an end, including at work and at home. It's a very handy skill to have, and I've just been learning it myself over the last few years. It all started. It actually started because of GLP. So
GLP,
it started,
the source of all.
Source of knowledge. So it in a way, it started in part because I knew that people were going to disbelieve SpaceX going into it, because SpaceX, when they announced that they were going to be flying their rockets back to the Cape and landing them, I knew if that actually happened, a lot of people were going to say, no frickin' way, that didn't happen. That's got to be a hoax. Because I knew just looking at, and they do, and sure enough they do. Looking at the preview videos, you could tell this is going to look unreal. It's going to look unreal, and people are going to therefore think it isn't real. And so I knew I wanted to up my game in terms of being able to track these launches. Now with my telescope, as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't have the capability naturally to track objects like that. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to track this.
Probably more designed to track just planets and such, right?
Exactly.
So
exactly.
You control with the computer. You write your own programs. That's pretty cool. Do the ones they sell nowadays, are they able to do stuff like that, or still not yet capable?
With third-party software, they can.
Okay.
There is a program that does a very similar thing, but it didn't support my telescope. My telescope was too old, and it didn't support it. So I was sort of forced to write my own that would support my telescope, and that's basically what I did.
Okay.
And doing that, I had to learn a lot about programming. Initially, really, even before that, it started out as a project where I hadn't anticipated the idea of doing automated tracking based on video input, where you could just click an object and it would track it. To me, that's really cool, but I never would have thought I could do that. Like, that to me sounded like that's going to be really, really difficult. There's no freaking way. And I was just going to be content with writing a program that simply allowed me to control it with the joystick. I just want to be able to, if I point the joystick up, the telescope goes up. Harder I push the joystick up, the faster the telescope should go up. That kind of thing.
That's cool.
And that was simple enough. But somebody posted on GLP in reply to an initial version of my software where I was already getting it to start tracking asteroids, and I was starting to work on the joystick functionality. And somebody said, you should check out this thing called OpenCV. It's a really good computer library for computer vision. You should think about tracking objects based on video. And I'm like, and again, at first my thought was, well, that would be great, but that's got to be way harder than anything I could do. But then I looked into their link, and sure enough, the hard work is basically already done using open source computer vision libraries. They're already out there. It's called OpenCV, Open Source Computer Vision, and it is useful for so many things. You could do so many amazing things with it. Now, granted, you have to know at least a little bit of programming, but it allows you to use this tool set to do a wide variety of tasks. And so that's what I ended up using to write my software. And I've used it again with this annotated SDO, but it uses OpenCV. And so it was thanks to GLP that I wouldn't have known about that. I wouldn't have known that existed or that I could do that.
I wouldn't have known about
GLP.
a lot. Yeah, I wouldn't have known about a lot of things without GLP. Man, learned a lot over there. Yeah, that's really that's really cool.
There are some very talented people that find their way to GLP. I mean, real industry professionals at times, and sometimes you have to dig through a lot of silliness to get at the gems, but they're there.
Cowards.
And just when you find one, you know it. You know it right away. You can tell the person knows what they're talking about, and sometimes they know a lot more than you about the subject. I don't claim to be the most knowledgeable person about astronomy on GLP. I know I'm not. I know there are people who are industry experts who know vastly more than I do. I might be more well known on GLP, but a lot of these guys don't tend to post all that much.
Yeah.
And I can't say I blame them for they see the flack I get for posting.
Well, you take it really well, my friend. You do really good.
Thank you.
Yes, you do. What's your favorite space fact? Do you have one?
That's a tough one. Well, I guess probably the fact that we're made out of the same stuff the stars are made out of. It's a cliche one.
Yeah.
Carl Sagan used to talk about it a lot, but it's a really cool fact. And you look at carbon stars, probably the most infamous star on GLP, the one that for years people were saying it's Nibiru on Google Sky. It's this really bright star in infrared that is virtually invisible to visible light. You see it when you turn on the infrared layer, it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's the brightest star in infrared light.
Wow.
And especially far infrared light. And so it happened. It's just coincidence. It happens to sit right on the ecliptic. And so people are saying, look, it's a planet. It shouldn't be there. It's got to be Nibiru. It's actually not. It's a well-known carbon star. And it's enshrouded in dust such that it emits a lot more infrared light reaches us than visible light.
Wow.
And so
yeah.
it's really cool. It's a star burning through carbon that's exhausted its supply of lighter elements. And so we're made of carbon. Our bodies are made up of that stuff. And here's a star that's using it for nuclear fuel. To me, that's amazing. And it also, like I say, happens to be the Nibiru star. So
it's coming.
It's coming, yeah. And I've seen it. And that's another fun thing, is it also provided an opportunity for me to prove that, yes, with an amateur telescope, you actually can see objects that can only be seen in infrared. I can put a filter on the telescope's camera that blocks out visible light and only allows infrared light through. And sure enough, you can see that star plain as day when I put that filter on.
Wow.
If I reverse it, I can reverse it and block out infrared light and only allow visible light through to the same camera. And sure enough, that star basically goes away. You can't really see it all that well anymore. But like I say, in visible light, it sticks out. So it's a good way of providing a proof of what my scope can do, and at the same time allows me to debunk a Nibiru conspiracy.
Definitely. That brings up something else that's in my mind about this one. I don't know if it's a star, but you're gonna know what I'm talking about. Where something's blocking it out. It's dimming. The light from it is dimming every so often. And
yeah.
Have you been? Are you able to observe an object like that? Is that too far out, or is that just something that? Have you looked into that much?
I could theoretically, and I sort of am kicking myself right now that I haven't taken the time to observe that particular star.
Yeah, it's a hot topic, especially on some of these Daily Mail type sites where it's a giant alien structure that's flying in front of it and stuff like that. And I don't know if they've quite figured it out yet.
They seem to be figuring some stuff out, and it sounds like it's unfortunately has a mundane explanation that could fit the facts. Initially, even professional astronomers were at least entertaining the possibility that if we were looking at what we call a Dyson swarm, this is basically what it could look like. So you've probably heard of
the Dyson sphere, where they build it around the sun to collect the energy. Giant structure.
Yeah, in fact, I was just watching the Star Trek episode that featured a Dyson sphere a few nights ago, and so there was this hypothesis that a super advanced civilization could harness all of the energy of their host star by building a giant sphere around it to collect that energy and use it to build a civilization. They wouldn't necessarily need to build a full sphere, though. They could just build sections of a sphere and what they call a Dyson swarm, where it's individual sections that have gaps between them, but basically huge structures that are way bigger than planets that would occasionally, potentially, eclipse that parent star and block out some or all of the light. And one of the things that suggested that maybe that was the case here was the fact that the light dips that they were seeing in the star were not symmetrical. Normally, if it's like a planet passing in front of the star, it should be symmetrical. It should be, the dip itself should look symmetrical on both sides if you graph it out. That wasn't the case here, suggesting that whatever was doing the blocking was irregular in shape. And the thing about objects that size is nature doesn't like to make irregular shaped objects that size. They form what they call hydrostatic equilibrium, where the self-gravity of the object tends to contract it into the shape of a sphere. That's why planets are spherical.
Right.
Sorry, flat earthers. They're spherical. But when you get down to very small objects like asteroids, they can be potato. They can be lumpy. They don't have enough gravity to pull themselves into a nice round spherical shape. But when you have large objects that are blocking out the light of a star, they ought to be spherical and therefore symmetrical. But whatever was doing the blocking didn't appear to be symmetrical, so that required some other explanation other than planets passing in front of it.
Yeah.
And so it opens up the possibility that, if we were looking at a Dyson swarm, that's kind of what you would expect to see. The other interesting clue about it was the fact that when they looked back at old archival photos of this star, looking back 100 years, we can find old sky surveys that were done on glass plates with early primitive photography.
Oh wow!
I don't know about 100 years, but certainly
quite a while ago.
Quite a while ago. Yeah, 1950s they were already doing all sky surveys stuff with photographic plates. And if you looked at that and you plotted out the brightness of that star over time, it was steadily decreasing. And then when they looked at it within just the Kepler data, so Kepler was the satellite that initially made this discovery. Its job was to observe for planets transiting in front of their parent stars, blocking out the light and detecting planets that way. And this weird star was found with this weird signature. That was Tabby's star. And even when they just looked within that satellite's lifespan, looking at that star over time, they noticed there was this trend of a steady decrease in brightness, suggesting that perhaps something was building up around the star. Maybe aliens? Maybe?
Aliens.
Yep. Gotta be aliens. But now I think they're coming to the conclusion that it could be something more mundane, and I don't want to get the details wrong.
Yeah,
but
it could be some kind of cloud of debris or something too.
Yeah,
that's something like that.
That I think is what they're leaning towards now, and perhaps this cloud of debris or dust is tilted or distorted a bit, and so it's not always over the star.
Right.
And sometimes it's potentially tilted more our way, and so it's blocking more light. Something like that. And I would love for it to be aliens, though. I know that SETI was directing radio telescopes to listen for signals. I don't think they picked up anything. There were rumors they did, but I think that was all just fake news.
Yeah. SETI's been around a while. Yeah, so you probably got your finger on the pulse a lot more than I do with the space industry, so to speak. In your opinion, what do you think is the most exciting recent discovery that's been made in astronomy?
That's a great question.
When did they discover exoplanets, by the way, the first one? Was it recently? Or in the 80s or 90s? It seems like...
I want to say it was 90s. And
I learned of that recently, and I was like, what? Really? Just in the 90s.
I want to say, was it 51 Pegasi? That was the first one. Okay. Well, it may not have been the very first star to find a planet. It was said, according to Wikipedia, it was the first main sequence star found to have an exoplanet orbiting it. And when was that? That was 1981 study, 89.
Yeah,
I'm not sure when they. Okay, so it said October 6th, 1995. So my birthday, and on 1995. There you go.
Wow.
Was when they announced the discovery of a planet around that star.
Yeah, that's just a little over 20 years ago. Yeah, that's crazy. You would, well, I guess we didn't even find Pluto until what, the 70s or 80s. It seems like we're starting to pick up on some discoveries in space, anyways.
Pluto was found a good while before that by Clyde Tombaugh, but
Okay.
uh, yeah, but it wasn't realized until more recently, and that's a whole interesting tale there. So when they first found Pluto, they thought it was Planet X. They were looking for a Planet X, a hidden planet that was distorting the orbits of Uranus and Neptune,
Right.
which were not matching up with their predicted positions quite, and it suggested there was another planet out there that remained to be discovered. That's how Neptune was actually found, was based on its perturbations of Uranus. Um, and so they were looking for a Planet X, and Pluto was in about the right location for that planet that they were looking for. So they thought it was a much more massive planet when they first found it. They thought it was much closer in size to Earth. And so they said, hey, mystery solved. We found our Planet X, our last planet in the solar system. Hooray. And that's why it initially attained, planet status. And closer to the late 70s, 80s, somewhere around there, I think, they discovered a moon of Pluto. And using that, they were able to measure the mass of the planet, because they can measure how long it takes the moon to go around the planet.
Right.
They can determine what the mass is. And it was largely the work of Robert Harrington that decided that that planet was not nearly as massive as they thought. Now, Planet X aficionados will recognize the name Robert Harrington, because he was the one that started proposing there's still a Planet X out there. Reason being, Pluto was not the Planet X they were looking
I've
for.
seen that Pluto wasn't big enough to cause the gravitational disruption in what, Uranus and Neptune, huh?
Exactly. So it was just a dinky little thing after all. It was not causing perturbations of Uranus and Neptune. So they resumed the search for Planet X. And then he unfortunately passed away of, I think it was esophageal cancer,
Dang.
sometime shortly thereafter. And, some people will say that's a conspiracy. He was poisoned. He was, they gave him the cancer, whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And shortly after his death, the final solution was found for that version of Planet X, where the Voyager probes going out into the outer solar system passed by Uranus and Neptune, and made surveys of the other planets too, Saturn and Jupiter. And basically, using that trajectory, they were able to measure the masses of those planets more precisely than could have been done before.
Okay.
Especially when you're talking about Uranus and Neptune, they're so far out there that although we can see their moons going around them, those moons, we can't resolve them in terms of their shapes with our telescopes on the ground.
Yeah.
They're just too small, and so they can only be measured oh so precisely.
Right.
And so there's a great deal of uncertainty there in terms of the actual position and therefore the actual mass of the planet. When the Voyager probes went by, that gave us a much more precise measurement tool. And so a physicist used that to recalculate the masses of the gas giants, and found that they were quite a bit off. In fact, I believe Neptune was off by about the same mass as Mars.
Wow.
So they were missing some significant mass out of their equations there.
Oh,
When they
okay.
changed those values, that explained the perturbations. The perturbations no longer existed.
Okay.
It all fit within the model of our solar system. And so people might say, well, how do you really know? How do you really know they didn't just fudge the numbers to make it go away? The problem with doing that, if that was what you were going to do, if this was a conspiracy to try to hide Planet X, if you change the mass of Neptune to try to cover up the data, that you might be able to find a solution to force fit it to fix the perturbations at that date. In other words, you can sort of imagine fudging the numbers to get the answer you want at a particular date. Okay, so in the 80s and early 90s, when they were doing this, yeah, they could have maybe fudged the numbers for then. But it's now been 20 years or more since that was done. And so the problem is, if that's not really where this is coming from, if this is coming from some other Planet X that's still out there, that's near the other planets, that's perturbing them, then the real source of those perturbations is not going to be at the location of Neptune, which has now moved in the last 20 years. And so that forced solution is no longer going to work. It would actually predict a different position for the current positions of the planets than a fudged number situation, if you see what I'm saying.
Right.
So I actually did the math on that and looked at what that would mean for the positions of the planets today. And it would start to produce a detectable error if that was really the case. If they had covered it up, and Robert Harrington's proposal was correct. He actually proposed an orbit for his planet X where he thought it would be. If his proposal was correct, that proposal would suggest a different position, a slightly different position for Neptune and Uranus than the NASA model, if you will, the model that we currently use for the positions of the planets, by about an arcsecond or so. I mean, 1/3600th of a degree, really tiny, but detectable even to an amateur telescope of sufficient size. So I checked that, and sure enough, the planets are where NASA says they should be, not where Robert Harrington's theory would have said they should be. Now, the story doesn't end there, though, because there is still a Planet X that they are pursuing. They call it Planet 9, and it's not based on the same set of data. It's not that Neptune and Uranus are out of whack. It's not that those planets aren't where they should be. It's that there are extreme trans-Neptunian objects, icy bodies out beyond Neptune, even beyond Pluto, that have these really elliptical orbits that are aligned in a peculiar way. And statistically speaking, if we were just randomly searching for objects and we grabbed names out of a hat, basically, and we looked at their orbits, we would expect a random distribution of the way those orbits are aligned. But that's not what we see. What we see seems to suggest that these orbits are aligned, co-aligned in a particular way. Something would have to be forcing that to happen, because that wouldn't naturally happen. They should naturally oscillate around randomly. Even if they started out the same, due to the gravity of our sun, our planets, the gravitational tides of the galaxy, all that should randomly start to distribute these things, and that doesn't seem to be happening. And so that suggests there's something else out there that has yet to be discovered, way beyond Neptune. And so that hypothesis posits a very different planet or massive object out beyond Neptune, way out beyond where Robert Harrington was looking, way out beyond his proposed orbit.
That is interesting.
A more massive object in a much further orbit that basically means it would be out there at Oort cloud sort of distances, maybe coming as close as about 200 AU. For perspective, our Voyager probes are now crossing about 115 AU, maybe a little further. I haven't checked lately, but they're still not anywhere near 200 AU. So even our Voyager probes would not have reached as far as this proposed object would come as at its closest point to the sun. So not something that's going to swing between our planet and the sun and be seen on SDO or anything like that. But still, there could be something out there that remains to be discovered that is significant enough to be influencing the orbits of Kuiper belt objects that are, in these extreme trans-Neptunian orbits. Now, more recently, there have been some alternatives proposed that might try to explain that don't require the presence of another ninth planet. So to be fair, there could be other explanations that exist that don't require that, but it's possible that it's out there and that's what's causing it. It's called the Kozai mechanism. I could be messing up the pronunciation there, but basically that's the mechanism where the planet causing this constraining perturbation of these extreme trans-Neptunian objects, the planet's causing these objects to be aligned with each other, its orbit would be aligned in an opposite direction. It would basically be 180 degrees opposed to these orbits that we've been finding. So that's where they're searching now.
And their orbits are pretty similar, so that's kind of off some by seeing that, right? That they're...
Yeah, that's what's weird, is that
bringing
they're
them
so
into
similar.
Balance there.
Something's right. And if that was the case, it's weird, it's counterintuitive, but that would mean that the object causing the perturbation ought to be aligned in the opposite direction, actually. Its furthest point from the sun would be on the opposite side of the solar system from these other objects. That's just how it works physically.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's funny, because I've run simulations before just to demonstrate to people, what would happen if a brown dwarf came into our inner solar system, into the region where the planets actually are, the major planets, and what would happen even in relatively short time scales on an astronomical scale, after just a few orbits in this whole, they say it's got a 3,600 year orbit. Okay, well, let's see what that would do to the planet. It's a brown dwarf on a 3,600 year orbit that carries it as close, even just as close as the asteroid belt, because they say, it collided with a protoplanet out there and formed the asteroid belt.
Right.
Okay, well,
it's gonna come flying right past us.
right, and if that's the case,
Oh man.
what would actually happen is some of the planets would probably get flung out of the solar system altogether, and the ones that remained would tend to be elongated into these really elliptical, wacky orbits that are basically constrained by the same Kozai mechanism. They would be in these elliptical orbits that are directly opposite and opposed to the Nibiru orbit. So we wouldn't have roughly circular orbits. We wouldn't be in this stable sort of situation in our solar system. The planets would be severely disrupted by something coming in that close, even after just a few orbits. So no, it doesn't seem like that's physically possible.
Yeah.
Because we'd be seeing the Kozai mechanism in the inner solar system. Instead, we're seeing it in the extreme outer solar system, which suggests there could be something out there, but it's not a direct threat to Earth.
Yeah, and I'd heard some people explain it like the brown dwarf situation, that most solar systems we observe are, the majority of them anyways, are binary systems. And I don't know if that's true or not. That's what I read probably on GLP.
Yeah, it gets bandied about a lot, and so there's a lot of research into that idea.
Yeah.
I know there was, and I need to dig more into it. There was more recently a research article that suggested all stars are formed as binaries,
Oh,
but
wow.
sometimes they lose their binary twin early in life,
Yeah.
and that could have happened to us. I don't know if that's true, but
Yeah.
if you look at the population of stars, a lot of them are single.
Okay.
And actually, it depends on what the percentage of stars, because obviously we don't know, we don't have identities of every single star in our galaxy, right? We don't have the ability to detect every single star in our galaxy. So a lot of this is extrapolated based on what we do know.
Right.
And so a lot of it depends upon how you model our galaxy, like what percentage of stars are red dwarfs versus what percentage are main sequence stars in the G, K, F variety, whatever.
Yeah.
Spectral class. So depending on how you weight that, you can end up calculating that actually most stars are single, because we tend to see that the red dwarf stars tend to be somewhat single compared to stars that are more like our sun. And in the solar neighborhood, in the local solar neighborhood in our local neck of the woods, you don't tend to see this vast overwhelming majority of double stars. There are some, certainly like Alpha Centauri, is a popular example, but statistically speaking, it's not mandated that we have a companion.
Right. It's kind of just a theory that
yeah,
they've observed
it's
a
just,
lot, so it's possible we could, which it could be, but yeah.
It could be, but yeah. And really, when you talk about a companion star, generally speaking, they're not talking about a brown dwarf. They're talking about another main sequence star that is next to that star.
like
Or
something like
even
Sirius or something like that, huh?
Sirius. Yeah, Sirius has a white dwarf companion, which was once probably a main sequence star. And then you have Alpha Centauri, which actually does have a red dwarf in that system. Proxima Centauri is actually a red dwarf, if I remember right. Proxima Centauri is like the closest star in that system to us, but you also have Alpha Centauri, which is a little bit further away, but it's in that system of gravitationally bound stars. But even if it were a red dwarf, right? If it were a red dwarf, we would see it. We see Proxima Centauri just fine. We found that one without a problem. So if it were a red dwarf in our solar system, it'd be even closer. We ought to see it. But obviously we don't. There's definitely not a red dwarf in our solar system. Now, whether there's a brown dwarf or some, and here's the other thing. How do you define brown dwarf? Because some astronomers would say you define a brown dwarf as having a minimum mass of 13 times Jupiter's mass, because at that mass, if you have a solar metallicity, if the composition of the object is similar to our sun, probably born out of the same nebula, then at 13 times Jupiter's mass, it will start to fuse deuterium. Deuterium is an isotope that is easier to fuse than regular hydrogen, and so it undergoes fusion at a lower pressure. But there's not much deuterium in a given star when it's born, so it runs out of deuterium pretty quickly. So it stops fusion early in its life. That's why they call it a failed star. It did undergo fusion like a star would, but not for very long because it's not big enough to fuse hydrogen. So it will burn up its deuterium supply starting around 13 times Jupiter's mass, thereabouts. So some astronomers would say that's the minimum. Any less than that, and you just have yourself a very large planet that never undergoes fusion. It doesn't fuse its deuterium supply. Larger than that, you have a brown dwarf. Other astronomers would say, no, 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 no. We don't care about how massive it is. We care about how it was formed. Did it form like a planet out of an accretion disk around a young star, or did it form itself as a star simultaneously with, a
Right.
parent star?
Like a couple of twins, right?
Like a couple of twins, just a very small sort of, failed twin that never reached enough mass to be a star. So there's a debate in the scientific community as to what a brown dwarf actually is, or what counts as a brown dwarf. I think in general, a good term for it would be less than 13 mass Jupiters or Jupiter masses. You would call it a sub-brown dwarf or a sub-dwarf. Like it may have formed like a star, but it hasn't reached enough mass to undergo fusion. And all that may be academic for a lot of people. They may not care. Like if there's a 10 times Jupiter's mass object, out there in the outer solar system, it would be really probably good to know about that.
Yeah, definitely.
And so do you even really care if you call it a brown dwarf or a sub-brown? Who cares? It's a big object. We ought to know about it, right? So I think in some ways it doesn't really matter, but that is a debate that is undertaken in scientific circles.
Oh, definitely. Astrobuzz has asked a couple questions. He asked about the galactic bow shock. Do you know anything about that? I was looking it up here. Looks like something to do with the magnetosphere and an ambient.
The heliosphere and all of that. So that's actually an interesting deal there because, so our heliosphere protects us from cosmic rays and interstellar radiation. And so you have this bow shock where the heliosphere butts up against interstellar flow.
Okay.
And if the sun undergoes when the sun goes through its solar cycle, that sphere can undergo changes in size as well. And when you have a sort of a prolonged solar minimum where the sun really shuts down and doesn't spit out as many solar flares and it doesn't have as many coronal mass ejections and its solar wind sort of dies down a bit, you can actually have a contraction of the heliosphere. And there's some scientists who think that at various points in the Earth's history, the sun may have gone so quiet that the heliosphere contracts to the point that the interstellar flow starts to encroach on Earth's orbit.
Oh.
If that happens, you have a much higher potential for a much higher rate of cosmic radiation, cosmic rays hitting Earth.
Yeah.
And that could alter Earth's climate. Obviously, that would be, if that happened now, that might
stuff.
Right. If that happened now, it might be bad for astronauts in space. It just wouldn't be a good thing. Now that we're nowhere near to that happening right now, the heliosphere is still, hanging out there around 100 AU radius, something like that. I mean, the Voyager probes just recently crossed that boundary.
Oh, did they?
Yeah,
we just pulled up an image for the guys on the live stream. They were showing Voyager 1 and 2 just before the heliosphere, but it looks there's a termination shock. Looks like Voyager 1. This is an old image from probably years ago, but they've gone interstellar with the Voyagers, huh?
Well, at least one of them. I don't know about Voyager 2, but I think with the furthest one, I think it's Voyager 1, is now considered to be in interstellar space because it's crossed that shock. And yet, ironically, like I said earlier, it's not even close to the Oort cloud yet. It's still got a ways to go before it reaches the Oort cloud where comets tend to hang out. Comets tend to hang out before they come into the inner solar system. It's interesting because we have funny ways of defining what counts as interstellar space, because on the one hand, yes, it's outside the heliosphere, so the radiation environment it's exposed to is more like what it would experience in interstellar space. But on the other hand, you still have comets and stuff that's out there way beyond where the Voyagers are. So yeah, it's kind of funny how that works. Yeah.
So as far as Hollywood and movies, what do you think what movie do you hold that you think is fairly accurate regarding astronomy? Do you like the movie Interstellar?
I do. It's a fun thinking movie. It really
Yeah.
works your brain and makes you think about
Yeah.
Einstein's relativity and time
Definitely.
dilation
Holy
and all
cow.
that. It's not. I have to sort of turn my orbital mechanics brain off a bit, because in terms of the space flight aspects of it, it is very, very fast and loose with the facts. But it's
Mhm.
okay, because for storytelling purposes, it tells such a compelling story. I don't care.
Yeah.
But like when they show, for example, they go down to that first watery planet,
Mhm.
and time dilation is really severe, and for every, I forget what it is, hour on the planet, 7 years go by or something like that, back on Earth.
Yeah.
Okay, they got this little shuttle thing, right, that they're going down to this planet with,
Mhm.
and they left their main mothership outside the gravity well so that that mothership's not experiencing that severe time dilation. How, I mean, if you if you're in that deep gravity well, you got to have some hella kind of thrust
To get
to be
out
able to
of it.
get back out of it.
Yeah, they're like right
Exactly.
next to a black hole or something.
They're right next to a black hole, and the way that time dilation works, you got to have really hellish acceleration to get out of it. You don't get into it and out of it for free like that. That's not how it works with physics. It's not like it just magically time starts accelerating for no reason. Time starts accelerating because you're in a really deep gravity well.
Yeah.
Getting out of it is really expensive. There is no way a tiny little shuttle like that could get out of it unless it's like Star Trek. And
Yeah.
obviously they weren't supposed to be at like Star Trek levels of technology here. It
No,
was
they're
supposed to be
just
like
a little bit beyond. Yeah, it's trying to figure out gravity still back on Earth.
exactly. So, but like I said, for storytelling purposes, I didn't care. It was such a good story. It was entertaining. In terms of accuracy, I would much prefer The Martian. I think The Martian was really well done.
Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah. That'll make you
And
feel claustrophobic. Holy cow.
oh yeah, I mean, even there, they admittedly take liberties with like how strong Martian storms are. There was a Martian storm recently that may have
The whole
killed
planet, huh?
Opportunity. Yeah, it may have killed Opportunity rover. I don't know
Wow.
if they. I don't think they're hearing from Opportunity yet, and they're hoping to regain contact with it. But last I heard, they still
Yeah, it said that
had
was like a
it.
planet-wide storm and makes Mars glow redder than usual, I guess. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, it obscures Mars's features for sure with the telescope. Like when it's a all global dust storm like that, it's harder to see the features. It looks just sort of more homogeneously orange than usual.
Okay.
The dust storm's pretty much cleared up now, though, and so they're hoping that their little rover Opportunity on the planet will start communicating again. But it basically, its batteries died because it didn't have enough solar power, so it was so darkened. But the winds in that storm are not. There's not enough pressure there to blow off towers and send communications dishes into astronaut suits and
Oh, okay.
things like that. That kind of thing. But
Yeah.
again, for storytelling purposes, they
Right.
had to have some sort of triggering event, so it had to be something. So they came up with the dust storm.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. But other than that, the movie is just so good. And really, what gets me about that movie, the thing that it captured so well that I don't think I've ever seen any other movie get right, is what an astronaut personality is like. Even Apollo 13, which until that point had been my favorite, they still took liberties with that in ways that I didn't think were great. Like the scene, if you remember the old Apollo 13 movie, the scene where Tom Hanks and his crew are arguing with each other in the capsule and they're yelling at each other. You remember that? They're kind of
It's been a
they're
while
kind
since I've seen that one.
okay. Well, it's generally a good movie, but there's a scene where I think it was Kevin Bacon was one of the astronauts. I think he was. So you had Fred Hayes, you had Jim Lovell, and you had Swaggart on the flight, right? And so Fred and Swaggart were fighting with each other about stirring the tanks, which caused the explosion. They're like yelling at each other. What was the pressure reading before you stirred the tanks? Did you like basically questioning each other's competence and stuff?
Yeah.
That never happened in reality. According to all the astronauts, that didn't happen. They just made that up to make the movie more dramatic.
It was more suspenseful, right?
More suspenseful. Yeah. It sort of degraded the professionalism and the the coolness under fire that astronauts really have.
Oh,
and
yeah.
and that's not that's not Hollywood, but that's really how it is. Like when the reason that Neil Armstrong was picked to be the first man on the moon, in part, was because of his performance under pressure in Gemini. His Gemini flight experienced a really severe problem where they were almost killed because their flight docked to this unmanned Agena adapter. And Dave Scott and Dave Scott and Neil Armstrong were flying this Gemini flight, docked to the adapter, and immediately their spacecraft started spinning. And they were out of contact with mission control. They were in a dead zone where they didn't have contact with mission control, and they had to solve it on their own. And they only had seconds.
Oh man!
Their capsule started spinning, and they were building up G's, and eventually it was going to cause them to pass out. Not to mention the fact that they were burning through their fuel. So they did the only thing they could do. They assumed that it was the Agena that was causing a short. Or some other problem with their thruster. Maybe it was a problem with the Agena's thrusters itself. So they undocked from the Agena just minutes after having docked to it, and it made them spin even faster because conservation of angular momentum. It's like if an ice figure skater brings their arms into their body, they start spinning faster.
Right. Okay.
So the capsule started accelerating even harder, and they had to switch to their reentry thrusters to slow down. They had a separate thruster system that was used for reentry, and they activated that thruster quadrant to basically bring the vehicle under control. But they got it under control out of tumbling in this crazy spin where they almost passed out and lost consciousness.
Oh man!
And so then they got back into contact with mission control and had to immediately deorbit because mission rules stated once you activated the reentry thruster system, you had to go ahead and proceed to reentry just in case you didn't want to use up your reentry fuel. So
it reminds me of that scene in Interstellar where they dock to that space station.
Yes.
Just after Matt Damon's character, Matt Damon again from the Mars movie, blows up part of it. That was man. Astronauts have some bravery. Wow.
It's like this meme picture I've seen. I love it. It says the U.S. has spent so much money rescuing Matt fucking Damon, and it's like Matt Damon in Interstellar, Matt Damon in Private Ryan, Matt Damon in Martian.
Yeah, I know.
So, but in The Martian, they did such a good job of getting his character right in that personality, just never giving up, never doubting himself, just working the problem.
That's
professional. What it's all about. Just working very professional, and yet definitely has a lighter side to it. And I've known astronauts, they have that sort of humorous lighter side even when talking about death-defying situations.
I'm sure they have to.
But at the same time they got that professionalism and that analytical mind that can just work through problems. That's why they're picked to be astronauts. So that was the only movie I've ever seen that really nailed it like that. And so for that I give it top marks.
If you were offered a chance to go to the space station, would you do it?
Absolutely.
I sometimes think about it, I'm like, man, some of those people that stay up there so long, gosh, it's crazy just being in a little thing and floating around and
I mean, it's not as spacious as Skylab in a sense. Skylab had this really wide open chamber. ISS is a little more claustrophobic maybe.
Yeah.
But the thing about it is when you're in 0G, you get to use all the space. There is no ceiling or floor for you. You can orient yourself however you want.
Oh, yeah.
And, if you'd asked me that question and I had to write shuttle, I'd be a little more hesitant, actually, because...
because you've seen it when you were a kid. My God. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was, like I said, there's no abort system there. If something goes wrong during the launch, well, you're either coming back with the vehicle intact or you're not coming back at all. And with the new rockets, though, it's a very different situation. Going back to capsules has the advantage of being able to abort at any time during the launch using an escape system, using secondary rockets that are sitting on your capsule ready to go. That if something goes wrong, you just punch out of there like an ejection. You just eject off that rocket, and away you go. And you're back in the ocean in a few minutes, and you're okay. And they're practicing right now, actually, how to do that sort of emergency rescue situation if they have to. Fishing astronauts out of the Atlantic. They're practicing that right now over on the Cape.
Oh, cool.
And that's capability they didn't have with shuttle, but that is capability they will have with both the Boeing capsule and the SpaceX capsule going forward.
Yeah, what's going on with the guy that's doing Virgin Airlines? Is he working on anything?
See, now there's another example. Yeah, Virgin Galactic. So that's Richard Branson.
Yeah, he was trying to do commercial space flight, like selling tickets, right, to go. I don't know how far out, but What's he up
just
to?
about 100. And so here, yeah, that's a interesting situation. There's an example. You could not pay me to get on that damn thing. You could not pay me money to get on that that vehicle. As badly as I want to go to space, not
Yeah.
in that thing.
I think people would
And
pay a lot to get on it. What was the ticket price? Like $1 million?
It's about $250,000 thereabouts. And the thing is, the current version of it, because they've had to weigh it down after the accident they've had. They had an accident at Spaceport America, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. I learned some stuff when I was out there a few weeks ago. They killed one of their test pilots, and the other one survived only because the vehicle just happened to disintegrate around him in such a way that he wasn't killed. The other guy, I don't know if this is publicly known. Here's some scoop for you. I don't think this is publicly known. I know it only because I was out at Spaceport America a few weeks ago, and I talked to the guys who are in charge of safety out there and stuff. The thing they told me, the test pilot who died was decapitated during the vehicle disintegrating.
Oh man.
What happened was they were going uphill. They had the rocket engine on. They're going uphill, and this vehicle is being basically manually steered. Like, the workload, they say, to fly this vehicle is much worse than it was with shuttle. Shuttle was pretty well automated. Like, going uphill, the astronauts only flipped a few switches. It was very little work for them to do. It was pretty much automated. With the Spaceship Two that they've developed as a reusable vehicle that's supposed to just basically go straight up and come back down, it's pretty much manual through a lot of it. And so one of the pilots accidentally hit the button that's supposed to unlock the feathering mechanism. It's got this big tail on the back end of it that is supposed to bend upwards and feather after they reach the peak. After the engines are off and they're drifting back down, it basically increases their drag ratio and allows them to
They both come up.
What's that?
We're looking at it on the live stream here. Are those the two that come up vertically from horizontally?
I'm not. Sorry, I'm not looking at the live stream at the moment.
No, that's fine. I was just wondering if that's what you're talking about with the tail. That has to be it there, yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be it. Yeah. So, that's supposed to come up and allow them to safely enter the atmosphere without going too hard into the atmosphere that they put too much strain on the vehicle.
Right.
The problem was he accidentally hit the unlock while they were still going uphill, and then it came undone. It started to deploy early while they were still going up and still in too thick of an atmosphere. And so it ripped the vehicle apart. It disintegrated it. And like I said, it decapitated one of the pilots. The other one got fortunate. The vehicle disintegrated around him without killing him. And I believe he was unconscious, but his parachute automatically deployed, and he was saved. He landed on the ground, and they recovered him, and he's okay now. Probably, I don't know if he's probably still dealing with, I would imagine he's still dealing with some injuries and whatnot. But anyway, yeah, they killed one test pilot because of that.
Yeah, they got
a
picture of the crash wreckage on here. My gosh, that thing is pretty small looking too.
Yeah,
Jeez.
I mean, it's not like you're going to be in spacious living in there while you're floating around for a few minutes.
Yeah.
And also, due to the changes they've had to make to the vehicle as a result of that accident, it will not reach 100 kilometers, which is the internationally recognized line of space. It's the Kármán line, where if it's defined by the altitude at which you would have to be traveling at orbital velocity if you wanted to generate enough lift with a winged plane to maintain altitude.
Okay.
So the higher you go, the faster you have to go to bite into what little is left of the atmosphere. At that altitude, you'd have to be traveling at orbital velocity anyway to get enough lift. So they say that's the international definition of space. So everyone wants to hit that line, obviously, to be able to say, I was in space.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, with the new changes they made to the vehicle, they're projecting it will get to about 80 kilometers. So close, but no cigar. Now, who really wants to pay $200,000 to go kind of high? I mean, really high, granted, but get 80% of the way to space?
Yeah.
Who wants to pay $200,000 to get 80% of the way to space? Probably not as many people.
Yeah.
I really question their business viability.
Especially after that accident. My God.
Yeah, and that's the thing.
A couple people would have to go first, I think.
Yeah. The biggest problem to me is that there is no – this is, again, like the space shuttle. There is no backup option here. If that rocket explodes – going uphill and the thing can't fly anymore, you're going to die. I mean, there's just no, unless you're very lucky and you just happen to have the vehicle disintegrate around you and you happen to have your parachute on, maybe you'll live.
Yeah.
But your odds are not good.
No.
Your odds are very, very bad at that point. Whereas they're probably what's going to be their chief competitor is going to be Blue Origin. Blue Origin is also developing a reusable space tourism vehicle. That's the new Shepard rocket, which will have astronauts or tourists in it that will reach space. I think they're planning to pass the Kármán line with the passengers on board, and on top of that, it has an abort motor inside the capsule. So if something goes wrong with the rocket, they can just punch out of there, and they'll probably actually still reach space. They actually did a test where they deliberately had the capsule punch out of there at its peak to make sure that no matter how high they went and how hard they came back down, they would come back down safely.
Wow.
And they did.
This thing looks comfortable inside this Blue Origin pod. I guess it'd come down with a parachute, huh?
Yes, they come down with a parachute.
Yeah.
And then I believe it's similar to the Soyuz. I think there's a motor system, a rocket system that fires right before they hit the ground so that they hit the ground as gently as possible, sort of as a last-second braking maneuver.
Wow, that looks cool. Look at that. They got leather seats. Looks nice. Damn.
Yeah, and, more spacious. I don't know how much time they're going to have in zero-G, but the preview videos show, the tourists sort of getting out of their seats and floating around inside the capsule. I think that would be really cool. I would gladly get in that thing.
Yeah.
But not the Virgin Galactic one, man. I'm sorry, that's a death trap.
Yeah.
And the Spaceport America people actually changed some rules out there after that happened. They because of that accident was considered to be pilot-induced error, they are doing everything they can to make sure that all future vehicles flying out of that spaceport, whether manned or not, have the human taken out of the loop as much as possible. The company I was working with for that launch that I was assisting with out there a few weeks ago have an unmanned reusable rocket that's just suborbital, goes straight up, comes back down. Mm-hmm. And although it's unmanned, they have the ability, because it was designed this way, to be able to command it from the ground. Nominally, the flight is completely automated. It's all done by the computer automatically. But this vehicle has heritage back to the Armadillo Aerospace days, where they were basically manually commanding this thing to vertically take off and vertically land with its engine.
Wow.
So it still has that built into the software. And yet the rules of the spaceport say that they are not allowed to take over manual control. They are not allowed to manually abort the mission. Really? Even if they see something going wrong, they're not allowed.
That's up to the ground people.
No one on the ground is allowed to touch it.
Oh, okay.
No one on the ground is allowed to do anything. To me, this was mind-boggling.
Wow.
The idea that even if you see something going wrong with the rocket, you're not allowed to enter the loop. You're not allowed to tell it to shut down. The idea is they want the vehicle to only fly if it's capable of taking care of itself so much that you would never have to think about entering the loop. In other words, they want it to be so safe that there should never be a situation where a human would have to take over manual control anyway, that it has auto-termination systems already in place.
Well, that's a good goal, but geez.
That's a good goal. But so here's the thing that happened during the launch. This is something else that's not publicly known. I'll leak it to you guys.
All right, we're getting the leaks tonight,
you won't
guys.
tell anybody, right?
No.
You won't tell anybody about this, right?
No.
So
just Trinity and
right.
GLP.
You didn't hear this. I don't want to see this posted on GLP. I don't want to see this posted anywhere. This is just between you, me, and the four walls.
Okay.
What happened during their flight, because the FAA, like I said, the FAA mandates all this stuff, right? And they had inspectors there watching like a hawk, everything happening.
I bet, yeah.
But while the vehicle's coming back, it's supposed to pop parachutes and then fly itself back to the launch site, actually. It uses GPS, and it's got a steerable parachute. It's very similar to the SpaceX plan to recover their payload fairings. I don't know if you've seen this. SpaceX wants to use parachutes to fly their payload fairings onto a giant net that they have on a boat, so that they can catch these payload fairings.
These
that
are like
cost millions of
steerable parachutes? Wow.
Yes, steerable parachutes, and it's basically military technology that they're repurposing, and so SpaceX plans to do that for their payload fairings, because these are basically giant fiberglass or carbon fiber or whatever lightweight shells that cost a lot of money to manufacture. So they want to grab them and reuse them, but they don't want them touching salt water, because again, that's bad for electronics.
Yeah.
So They want to do that with these payload fairings, but this other company does the same thing with the same technology for their rocket because it's a much smaller rocket. They can just pop a parachute with it. So we're watching the launch, and it's coming back, and they're watching it coming back, and the drogue chute deploys. So the drogue chute is supposed to initially stabilize the vehicle, but it's not the main parachute. And the drogue chute's out for a while, and they also have this balloon thing. It's an inflatable parachute idea, and basically it's part balloon, part parachute. It helps it in the upper atmosphere where there's not much to grab onto to help it to slow down as it starts to enter the atmosphere. So it's got the balloon out or the drogue chute, and they're waiting for the main chutes to come out. And the guys on the ground are just nervous as hell, and it feels like it's taking forever. And they're like, come on, main chutes. You know, they're waiting for the main chutes to pop.
Right.
And guy who is at the computer system that was overseeing all the systems of the launch. Basically, it's one guy who can fire this thing off. Now, he's got a whole team of people supporting him, but it's really one guy at the switch, you know, that fires this thing off. And he could take over manual control because it's still built into the software, even though, according to the rules. According to the FAA, they're not allowed to. But he turns to the big boss. He turns to the head honcho there. He says, "Boss, do you want me to fire the chutes?"
What do you think?
And they're like, no, wait a minute. It'll do it. And sure enough, it did. It deployed at the proper altitude. They were just getting nervous because it felt like it was taking long. It wasn't. It was, it's just human perception to talk about. And that is really, that is actually why they don't want humans in the loop, because we get nervous, we get panicky.
Yeah.
We might do something that we think is going to fix a problem, and it could actually make a bigger problem.
Well,
if they deploy the chutes.
They say that in Interstellar about the robots that they have with them. They're like, we can't program fear, you know? It's humans.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that was Matt Damon again.
Yeah.
Matt Damon, props.
Yeah, exactly. So, that was, I think, a great example of why they instituted those rules, and really sometimes you have to trust the machine more than the human, because you got to take emotion out of it and just look at the data and what the data is really telling you. And it's hard to do that in a very dynamic situation like that, which is, again, why I would much prefer to fly on like a fully automated Blue Origin vehicle than a manually steered Virgin Galactic with no abort capability vehicle.
Yeah, and I'm with you there. I mean, a lot of that stuff is stressful. I could see somebody doing that job, knowing what the craft costs, knowing how much you guys paid for the seats, and they're nervous as hell, and you're like, oh, somebody's controlling this craft, and they're nervous as shit. I hope they don't screw up in their nervousness, whereas a computer doesn't get so nervous at all. But what do you think about Robert Bigelow and what he's doing with Bigelow Aerospace?
Oh, yeah, that's mind-blowing stuff to me. So, for those who don't know, Robert Bigelow is also a guy who's really big in the UFO community. Like, he's really on that topic and really wants to find proof of alien life visiting Earth. So years ago, he launched a couple of test space stations, basically inflatable. He's coming up with the idea of inflatable space station modules and spacecraft modules that you can pack them much tighter into the rocket, and then inflate them once they get into space to basically expand them a bit and get more volume out of a given launch, even though the rocket may not be able to hold such a big volume. And so he had done some test launches with some unmanned modules that were inflated in space and just free flying, and had webcams on it and stuff. And he was like, seriously trying to see if he could find any evidence of UFOs flying around up there and stuff as well. And now, more recently with CRS-8, that same launch I was at that I talked about before, where they did the first successful landing on the boat with the SpaceX rocket, that also happened to be the launch where they put an inflatable Bigelow module on the space station called Beam. Wow. And so you had here just this, to me, it was surreal thinking about it at the launch. You have a rocket that is developed by a private company, not by one of the big government contractors, but by a private company and a private citizen, launching a module that will attach to the space station that astronauts will be inside, also developed by a private citizen and a private company, who is himself a UFO aficionado who's really big in the UFO community. I mean, it's science fiction. You couldn't have made this stuff up. It's pretty crazy. Awesome. It is pretty awesome. And like 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to predict that would happen. I mean, it just seemed unreal, and it happened. And successfully attached beam, inflated on the space station. Had some issues during the inflation, I think. Just it seemed like they just want to make sure they didn't pop it, basically, or damage it.
That thing's
But they
huge.
finally, it is, and they finally got it deployed and went in and tested it, and it's still attached. I think. I don't think they've removed it yet.
I'm sure you've captured the space station a lot, haven't? I think that one's pretty
Yes.
easy to do. I've seen a lot of people doing that. That's pretty fascinating.
Well, easy is a relative term.
No,
Yes,
I mean, as far as being able to spot it, I think you can even see it with the naked eye,
yeah.
you know. But no, technically speaking, yeah, I'd have to come to you. Hey, man, how do I do this?
Well, and that's something I'm working on is trying to make that a much easier process. Like, yes, by eye it's easy. With binoculars it's easy. You can just look up and see it and track it. With a telescope, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, or like trying to find, you're looking at this tiny little light through a straw. You're looking at a very tiny portion of the sky, so you have to be super precise. And you can do it the sort of the I won't call it the cheaty way, but the easy way would be to take a simple telescope that doesn't even necessarily have motorized tracking, but just put a video camera into the telescope, focus it, and then point the telescope at the station through the viewfinder, and just sort of try to get it in some of the frames. You won't get clean video, but in some of the video frames you might get it for a moment, and you might get a good still picture out of it. You're not really going to get good video. But what I want to do is develop my software some more so that it's easy to get really good video of the space station if you have a telescope that has a motorized mount, provided it can communicate with my software properly. So that's one thing I'm working on is porting my software to Python and to use universal drivers to open it up for many more kinds of telescopes to easily use it. And the idea being that it's as simple as point and click, where you don't have to steer it with a joystick or anything. You just tell it, okay, here's the orbital data on the space station, upload that, now go chase it. And then it will appear on your viewfinder camera, so you'll have like a video camera mounted on top of the telescope. And the space station, like you said, it's very bright, it's easy to see. So it'll show up as a bright star-like object somewhere in that viewfinder camera. Then all you have to do is click on it, and it will track it. And just to center it up for you, and then you can casually go over to the telescope, look through the eyepiece, not have to touch the telescope at all, but it'll be centered up for you, and you can view it in all of its glory. And let me tell you, I've done that before with my telescope, and it's again one of those objects that it's very hard to do justice to it with pictures. Through the eyepiece, just by eye, it is gorgeous beyond description.
Wow.
The amber colors of the solar panels really stand out. The reflective metallic nature of the habitat sections really stand out. It's just a fantastic object. It ranks right up there with Saturn in terms of the breathtaking nature of it. And when you realize, because it's about as big as Saturn, if not bigger, when it's at its closest point, if it goes right overhead. It's quite large relative to planets in the eyepiece. Yeah. So it's easy to see a lot of detail with it if you have a decent telescope. And my hope is that I can open this idea of tracking it up to a lot more people who might not think they have the skill to do it. And even if they do, they may be restricted to sort of just putting a video camera in there and trying to get it on a few video frames. But if you can really just sit there and appreciate it in the eyepiece, it really changes your perspective when you realize there's people living on that thing right now all the time.
I know.
And
it's crazy.
It's crazy. It's futuristic.
Yeah, it definitely is. And like you said, you would jump at the chance for it. And I think a lot of people, if they thought about it, really they would. That's why this commercial thing is working. Like what Richard Branson's doing, what some of these people are doing. Eventually, it might be something that everyday people could afford.
The paradigm is going to shift, and it's going to shift sooner than people think. And it's not necessarily because they're going to come out with UFO floaty tech that just, we go up there like Star Trek. I mean, it'd be great if they did, but I don't think that's going to happen. And it doesn't really need to for the paradigm to shift. Talk about Elon Musk's BFS thing, and a lot of people still think that's a pipe dream. NASA is acting like it's a pipe dream. They're not saying that, but they are acting as if the SLS rocket they're developing is going to be the only game in town for heavy lift capability for many years to come. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. SLS is this big, heavy, expendable rocket, one-time use only, just like Saturn, just like Apollo. And it's going to be very expensive to launch it. They talk about, well, this is going to get us to Mars. I don't think that's going to be the case. I could be wrong, but I think the SpaceX BFR BFS idea is going to change the paradigm so radically that it won't be politically feasible to spend billions of dollars on a heavy lift launch to put up what 1 or 2 or 3 BFR launches could have put up for a tiny fraction of the price.
Definitely. I mean, the reusable rocket thing that Elon and SpaceX has brought to the table is just that just changes the game big time.
It does. And when you think about a rocket that is 100% reusable, right now the Falcon 9, the first stage is reusable. The second stage is still expendable, and sometimes they can reuse the capsules, although they're talking about right now with like the manned capsules, those will only be reused for cargo. They won't put people in them a second time until they get approval from NASA, because salt water, bad, but we can trust it with cargo, not people the second time around. But when you talk about a vehicle that is 100% reusable and rapidly so, if that comes true, and that was supposed to be the dream of the space shuttle, right? That's why Krista McAuliffe was on board, going back to the beginning of our talk. That was the dream of the space shuttle. I think BFR can make that dream come true. And if it does, then that's going to change the paradigm, because it's going to bring down the cost to get stuff into orbit by orders of magnitude. People don't believe it, but when Elon Musk shows the chart showing the cost of putting stuff in orbit, and he shows, like, here's Falcon 1, our tiny little rocket we started with, here's Falcon 9, here's Falcon Heavy, and then BFR BFS is all the way down at the bottom of that chart, the cheapest, even cheaper than Falcon 1. People look at that and say, that doesn't make any sense. How can that be cheaper than this dinky little rocket that you built to start off with? The reason being, it's 100% reusable. If you can use that many, many times, then it doesn't cost so much. All it costs is the fuel, which is not that much. And so if you can do that without having to do heavy-duty refurbishment, which that's not a 100% guarantee. It could turn out to be another shuttle and another failed promise, but I think there's a much better chance for BFR BFS to succeed than shuttle to meet its goals, because unlike shuttle, SpaceX has complete control over the design. They can design it to do what they need it to do. They aren't being dictated by the military saying it needs to be able to do this and complete this mission, even though that's not really what it was supposed to be able to do. So they have much greater control, and they're building it on their own. This is them funding it through profits they're making on other launches. Mm-hmm. It's not NASA telling them to go build this. So they have a much greater degree of control, and I think for that reason, it's got a much better chance of succeeding. And if it does, I'm telling you right now, SLS is a dead duck. It's not going to be politically feasible. And at the same time, it will open up tourism in a way people aren't expecting. I mean, they're already talking about this, Japanese billionaire flying to the moon and bringing some artists with him. Okay, wow. That's great. But I mean, that's great. It's great, but it's still a billionaire's plaything with his chosen artist friends. But that's just the first launch, and really that's not the first launch, but that's the first tourist to sign up, and he's really helping fund the development of the rocket in doing that. Once it's developed and once it's flying routinely, that price is going to start coming down, and eventually it's going to get to the point first where billionaires start getting on board. Okay, people are still going to say, all right, but that's just the millionaires. Then it's going to start being upper middle class, and then middle class, and it's going to change the paradigm, because it's going to reach a point, I think, if you just look at fuel costs and you consider that they can make the maintenance fairly easy for themselves, it could reach a point of efficiency where it's like about the same cost as a first class cross Atlantic ticket or something like that. I mean, still really expensive.
Yeah, maybe a couple grand. But hey, man,
a couple grand. Yeah, I mean, even if it were 10 grand. Would you save up and spend 10 grand for a chance to go into orbit?
I think so. Would. If I trusted it, yeah, I think so. I think it would be worth it. Definitely.
So I think a lot of people will, and I think that's when the future is going to start to really change, and it'll probably happen so slowly that people won't really notice at first. But then someday we're going to look back and we're going to say, "Wait, we're here. This is what we said the future should look like." I think about it today with just stupid stuff like cell phones and tablets. I'm watching, I was rewatching Star Trek Next Generation over the last few weeks, and back then when that show was on, people were having, people on the show had these little tablet things and touch screens and all this stuff that looked like future tech, and now we just take it for granted. We all have it. We all take it for granted.
I know, it's
the future's
crazy.
Here.
I know. I tell people all the time, like, man, if you wanted to know where Bruce Springsteen was born, how would you find that out? You'd have to call people, maybe go down to the library. It'd take you probably all day to find that information. Now it takes 2 seconds.
Takes 2 seconds.
We take that for granted.
You can literally ask your AI-powered little Alexa device in your kitchen.
Yeah.
Where was Bruce Springsteen born? And she'll tell you.
Boom, 2 seconds. The access to information is lightning speed.
Yeah, that is literally Star Trek. That's Star Trek computer. Tell me this, and it will.
Yep. The only thing we're missing is the Star Trek space travel, which this is why this is all so great with SpaceX and this competition that's happening with Bezos and these other guys, Branson. What do you think Elon Musk's current situation, what he's getting into with the SEC, do you think that's going to hurt SpaceX at all, or is that just kind of a maybe hurt the Tesla company?
I think it might hurt Tesla, but
nothing.
Like I said, I don't follow Tesla as closely as SpaceX, obviously.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll hurt SpaceX so much, mainly because SpaceX is not publicly traded. My understanding was the SEC deal was actually to try to force Elon Musk to not be chairman of any publicly traded company.
Wow.
Which, of course, would include Tesla. But SpaceX is not publicly traded, so it doesn't affect SpaceX.
Okay.
Now, they would never, ever say this publicly. Like, Gwen Shotwell, she runs the stuff day to day over there. She's I think she's chief operating officer at SpaceX. She's basically, or president or something. She's basically the day to day person who runs it. And so, yeah, Elon Musk can go through some crazy stuff and say crazy stuff and have some negative press.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily going to affect day-to-day operations at SpaceX. But the real concern is if he gets himself into so much trouble that, I know Department of Justice is looking into it, although they're saying because he's now out at Tesla as chairman, that will probably diffuse the situation with the DOJ. But if he, hypothetically, if he was going to jail because of, securities fraud or whatever to do with Tesla, that might hurt SpaceX's overall future. Because he is the vision guy, and I think he's the guy that keeps them on course towards the big dreams that other people wouldn't dare to dream.
He's kind of a Steve Jobs character in a way.
Yes,
they're both very smart. They both are kind of, well, I think Elon Musk may be a little more on the engineering side, but they both have a knack for getting people together to make stuff happen. Yes,
absolutely. I think that's a great analogy. They both have their eccentricities and their quirks.
Yeah. He is very
much
eccentric. It seemed odd. I watched that podcast with Joe Rogan, and it was he's like, wow, I didn't know he even kind of acted like that. But there's nothing wrong with being odd. Just means you're different. That's cool. Hey.
Yeah.
We all knew he was different.
I think he's necessary as a catalyst for some of these big pipe dream sort of ideas, because
Hyperloop.
Without him, Hyperloop and with SpaceX, if you look at the history of it, I don't think they would have done this whole reusable rocket propulsive flyback and landing idea without him. I don't think that would have happened. It was a risky move, honestly, because if that didn't work, that was a lot of R&D money down the drain. The same for BFR or BFS. That's a risky move because they already have, right now, they have the most popular rocket in the world. You realize that?
Yeah.
The Falcon 9. The Falcon 9 launches more each year now than any other individual rocket anywhere in the world. They have cornered the market for commercial launches. And so the problem they're facing then is they're working in the future now to undermine their own product, which is the top of the world product. They're saying, okay, we're going to build an even better rocket than the Falcon 9. Well, you guys have already got the top of the market, and now in a few years, you're already working to make it obsolete and stop making it.
That's crazy.
Any sane company would say, that's nuts. Why would you do that? I mean, ULA would never do that. You had to force them to try to reuse their engines without even trying to reuse the whole rocket, right? So, no other company would be that radical, I don't think. And the reason it's able to be that radical is Elon Musk is the vision man for that.
Yeah, that's great. We pulled up a chart here showing the cost per kilogram. Space shuttle was 19,000 per kilogram, and this latest Falcon 9 reused 1,900 per kilogram.
Yeah.
And that's that's like 10. That's like 100 times cheaper, something like that. I'm terrible at math, I guess, right now at 2 in the morning, but something like that. It's a lot cheaper, that's for sure. My gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does he have a vision to get to Mars? He does. He wears that T-shirt. I know a lot of guys do. Get your ass to Mars.
Occupy Mars, yeah, yeah. I remember those. Those T-shirts have been for sale at the Space Center Visitor Center for years now. And he might be the guy that makes it happen. And he does have that vision. I still think that is probably further off than what he's saying. He's very ambitious on that, and I think we all know from the history of the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy, like how things get delayed. Eventually, it does happen, but it can get delayed quite a bit. The deal with that is it will require BFR, BFS to be a matured system because to get to Mars, they're going to have to refuel the vehicle in orbit. So that's going to require multiple launches to get it ready to go to Mars. And plus, you got to get all the supplies pre-cached at Mars. Like you want to have your base supplies already set up and to be able to demonstrate that you're able to land right next to those supplies. Right now, you look at like the Curiosity rover that we landed on Mars using pretty much a propulsive landing system. It used the sky crane. There's this crazy system that hovered on rockets and lowered the rover down on wires.
Oh, wow.
So it was a lot more precise than just dropping it with airbags the way that Opportunity and Spirit were with the Mars exploration rovers, where they did this bouncy castle on Mars idea.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, that's going to be less accurate than precision landing with rockets. But even Curiosity, if you look at its air, what they call the air ellipse, the region of Mars it could potentially land on, even coming up, the day before landing, they didn't know exactly where it was going to land. They knew within plus or minus a kilometer at best.
Mm-hmm.
At best.
Yeah.
If you're trying to land your big big Falcon spaceship rocket right next to your other big Falcon spaceship rocket that's already there waiting for you with a ton of supplies and stuff, and maybe a fuel processing plant and all that, you can't afford to land a kilometer away. You're not going to have hoses that reach that long. You're probably not going to be in physical shape to hike it and get that all set up. And if you have to do that, you need to be able to land it right next to each other practically. So you need a lot more precision. You can do that, fortunately, if you're using a propulsive landing technique like they tend to do. But that's something that's got to be demonstrated on Mars before we start sending people there. So that's a lengthy process because, like I said, it's going to take multiple launches to fuel it up to send it out there. Then you got to send another one out there to prove that it can be done. Then you got to start preparing. It's a lot of launches, and you only get an opportunity to launch towards Mars once every 2 years or so.
Yeah.
So it's not like you can just decide this summer we're going to do it. It's got to be the right summer. It's got to be on the years that you can do it.
Well, we're getting close to the end here of our time, but I got another question for you, and that's when you're old, you're towards the end of your life, you're sitting on your porch with all your grandkids surrounding your family, and you've lived your life. Where do you see us being your best guess with space travel at that time? What's your hope? What's your outlook for it?
My hope is that my front porch will be on Mars, honestly. I would love for that to be the case.
Hell yeah.
I'd love to retire on Mars. That would be great. I don't know if that will be possible at that time in terms of the cost and everything. But I'm hoping that's the case, and it's really going to come down to the success of BFR, BFS probably, or alternatively maybe Blue Origin. The Blue Origin's vision's more for the moon and sort of local Earth space, building stations for people to live and work in space around Earth and the moon and stuff. And that would be fine with me too. I'd be cool with that. So I'm hoping that by the time I'm retired and an old grizzly old man, that I can pick a space in space to settle down and live out the remainder of my life.
That's awesome outlook. Hey, maybe we'll be there. It could happen.
Yeah,
Definitely. The
it
way
could.
Things are going.
It could definitely happen.
Well, hey, listen, man, we're gonna go ahead and this has been 3 hours. I've absolutely loved talking to you, man. This has been great. We're gonna have to do this again, but I wanna really thank you for coming on. Everybody, Dr. Deplorable Astromut on GLP, and his YouTube channel is Astronomy Live. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, Astronomy Live. Go over there and subscribe to him. Show him some love. Go over to GLP. Give him some green karma for coming on, man. Thank you so much, dude.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, you bet. Well, you go get some sleep. You're going to need it because you're going to help us get to Mars or somewhere in the future. I know you are.
Hope so.
And
Hopefully, in a little bit here, might just be helping out with some space station stuff. So we'll see.
Oh, man. Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on, Astro. I hope to talk to you in the future. Hear about the great things that are happening. It's exciting to see all this coming about.
Okay, cool. Thanks, man.
All right. Take care, buddy. See you.
Good night.
Good night. All right, guys, that was Astro. We're all done. I got one more thing for you, though. The Anomaly called into our phone line and left a message, so I'm going to play that for you. It's not really space-related, but I figured you'd want to hear it, and then we're just going to cut the show. This is the Hidden Path Podcast. You know us. GLP, guys, thanks for coming out and listening to us tonight and your questions and everything. I'll go ahead and leave it with this.
The American public fails to understand that circumcision, inoculation, vitamin K injections, everything they do to your infant as they are born are all done for a specific purpose to separate them from the reality of creation. Vaccinations include chemicals that are designed to destroy your cerebral cortex, which you may or may not know is illustrated in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as the mind of Adam reaches to the hand of God. Severance of the foreskin of the male infant empowers the Luciferian principles, our neurological destroyers.
Do you hear this guy?
What they fail to understand is that once people begin to move from vaccinations, they'll simply call it vitamin K and call it a necessary requirement for injection. Most societies recognize that sticking infants with needles and cutting them with razor knives is quite clearly not positive. However, these things are encouraged in the allopathic medical system. This is a transmission from the Anomaly.
I don't really know what that was. I don't know what he was talking about, but he said he was the Anomaly. He left us a message. I just thought I'd play it. Man, crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. Again, guys, thanks for tuning in. You guys are awesome. Go over and give Dr. Deplorable Astromut some love at GLP. Show him some love, guys. Give him some karma. That was a great show. We'll have the podcast up. You can get all the information at www.hiddenpathpodcast.com. You guys have a good night and a good rest of your weekend.